Good morning. How are we doing this morning? I got peanut gallery back there in the back, so also. As true firefighters all go, and I'm going to pick on you for a second because you must not be a true firefighter because you have sat in the front of the class. Very, very good. That's smart. But as all true firefighters I see, we've launched in the back of the room here. Just a couple of brief announcements. As you can see, we have a camera. We're going to be taped this first session this morning. The afternoon session won't be taped. So hold your cussing and throwing of objects to a dull roar, if you would, please. The IFF frowns on that, but just to go. Good morning, folks. My name is Rick Swan, and this morning what we're going to do is, today we're going to talk about the WUI situation, a wildland urban interface, and we're going to give you an update on some of the things and some of the programs that are out there for us. Just a brief introduction for myself. I retired from CAL FIRE after 33 years. I was a firefighter in San Luis Obispo County and started off there, moved around the state. I retired as a deputy chief in San Luis Obispo County, came back around the corner there. And I've also been the vice president of CDF Firefighters Local 2881 for 4 years and been on our executive board since 1998. Been around with the IFF and working with the IFF Wildland Policy Group, and have done some things for the IFF for Wildland and in support of the Wildland fire community and those activities that go on, especially now since they have this thing called climate change coming about and all the little nuances that everyone wants to know about here in the coming forward from since the Prescott tragedy and now since these fires are going. So today what we're going to talk about is the WUI, or Wildland Urban Interface, and safety and tactics. And, we're going to talk today, we have some experts in the field of these programs. We're going to talk about research, we're going to talk about GIS and pre-planning, training, fuel management or mitigation, and operations and fire scope piece. So what we've assembled a wide variety of folks from across the states here. And Nelson Briner from NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, and he's the Wildland Urban Interface Fire Management Manager. Excuse me. And Nelson's going to tell us about the research that's going on into the Wildland Urban Interface phenomena and ignition and how we can understand what's going on behind the scenes and the research going on to help us through that program. We also have today Tommy Price. He's from local S20, the Florida State Firefighters Association, and he's a training instructor for Tampa and Hillsborough County, and he's going to talk to us today about the training that goes on, some of the aspects that go on, and the requirements through NWCG and those pieces that you have to have in order to go out on these wildland fires. We also have Joe Larson. He's from San Luis Obispo, and he's a research analyst. And he's going to talk to us about some of the pre-planning that goes on and using GIS and prioritizing some of those vegetation programs and evacuation projects. And you're going to see some maps of some evacuation and some pre-action plans that the County of San Luis Obispo and the unit of San Luis Obispo CAL FIRE has created. We also have Justin Smith. He's from Local 5, just down the road, Colorado Springs. I think some of you will probably remember a few years ago there's a thing called the Waldo fire that came through, and but their community has a very good fuel mitigation program, and we're going to hear from him today on the projects and how fuel mitigation and how the fire and the embers, and you'll see some videos of what goes on in that process and give you a little idea and some techniques on how to work and deal with that prior to an incident. And then also today we have Phil Veneras. He's from Local 2881 and a battalion chief for CAL FIRE in San Luis Obispo unit. And Phil's been part of a team that's been ongoing from FireScope and produced the WUI operations program. And this is going to be coming out soon. They've just produced a book, and it's going to be coming out hopefully in a year. It depends on the publication aspects of it. And these are some of the techniques that we're going to be able to put together as far as what you do, how you can operate in and out of the WUI environment. Fascinating piece. This is what our department's using now. And we'll also give you some handouts and different pieces in order for the program. Now you're going to see some, actually you're going to see a lot of links to different websites and resources. Don't worry about writing them down. Everybody will get a sheet if you want it. If you don't have to have it. But anyway, we have the sheets. I have all of the web resources here on the sheet, and our email addresses if you've missed something. So you don't have to worry about writing them down. Don't have to worry about going back, because one on here has got about 400 letters in it, and you'll never get it right. So, but there's some really great resources you can take back to your cities and learn some stuff. So with that, before we go forward here, a reminder of the taping. Cell phones, can we put them on stun, please? So that we don't have to worry about that if we haven't already. And the program is going to be a little bit, you're going to get a lot of information here. And we're going to be moving through these things. We want to kind of make it free-flowing. You're going to see us walk around and kind of be interactive. But we do want to get the information out. We do want to get the information moving. So if you can everyone has a tablet in front of them. If you have a pen, if you need a pen, let me know or do it. Write your questions down. We're trying to get them, if we can, right there at the program as we're going through. We'll have some time there. At 10:30, we're going to take a break. Or 10 o'clock, we'll take a break. We'll go right back into it around 10:30, and we'll go until noon and finish our program up. So there'll be time for question and answers. But we want to get this information out. We want to get this information passed on to you. So if you have any questions, try to hold them if you can. And we'll answer anything either at the break or afterwards if we don't answer them during the program. So with that, I'd like to introduce Nelson Brigham. Nelson, and I'm going to have to read this. I'm not going to read it all because it's pretty long. Nelson is with NIST. He's the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And I met Nelson several years ago in some of the programs, and he's started as part of this WUI, or Wildland Urban Interface Fire Group. NIST has just, this is a phenomenon that's started to come up, and while the WUI is not a new phenomenon, it's been out there for a long time, we're trying to understand what's going on with it. We're trying to get an idea of how we can best participate and mitigate as best we can with it. So Nelson and his group have been working heavily on a lot of the new research and the new things that we're looking at, and you're going to see some stuff today, the different pieces that are out there. And a WUI scaling system, kind of like the hurricane scale system that new program that we're looking at. So with that, Nelson, please.
Okay, thank you, Rick. As Rick indicated, I'll be talking a little bit about research as well as providing some background so that we're all sort of on the same page. So first off, we will define what WUI is and where it's at. We'll talk about the magnitude of the issue, what's the impact, both in terms of the firefighter as well as the community. Why is this problem so hard to solve? We'll review some fluid dynamics, fire dynamics, spread, and fire behavior, and then we'll talk a little bit about research and research needs. So what is WUI? Well, in one sense, WUI is wherever urban and wildlands meet, but there's different definitions. Sometimes the interface is well-defined, clear delineation. You have a city or a suburb right next to a wildland area. That's what we term the classic interface or the interface community itself. But I'm sure you're all familiar with a situation where you have structures that are scattered within the wildlands. We refer to that as the intermixed community. We also can see situations where you have an island of vegetation in the middle of a otherwise urban area. We refer to that as an occluded community. Now this is a map, 2010, of the wildland urban interface areas in the United States. Again, the yellow and red are the interface and the intermix. And one thing you'll note is that much of the red actually appears on the eastern seaboard. Okay? Some people find that rather surprising. But the states with most of the WUI are actually in the eastern half of the United States. As you move west to places like Texas, you discover areas where you have a ring of yellow or red around a major metropolitan area, such as Dallas, Fort Worth, or Houston, or San Antonio, or Texas. If you look hard, the lighting's kind of difficult, but if you look hard, you can see there's one around Denver as well. You can also see that there's yellow and red throughout California, as well as Oregon and Washington. So all states have WUI. Some states have as much as 75% WUI. Anybody want to guess what state has the most WUI? I hear California. Wrong. No, not Alaska. North Carolina. Okay. Now, why don't you hear about the WUI problem in North Carolina? Because they keep it green. Okay. So across the United States, about 9.5% is actually in the WUI. As I mentioned, it's mostly along the eastern seaboard. It's the northeastern states that actually have the greatest percentage of WUI, where it's been built out the most. However, although WUI is not extensive along the West Coast, it does encompass a high percentage of the homes, particularly in fire-prone areas. And that's why you might have guessed California. North Carolina is actually the state that has the most. California, Florida, and Texas have the largest number of homes where the vegetation has the highest density. Across the United States, about 39% of the homes are in the WUI right now. We've built out between 10 and 15% of the WUI. So the problem is not going to get any smaller. In terms of impact on the firefighter, this is some data pulled together by the National Fire Protection Association looking at fireground fatalities as a function of fixed property use. Some of you might find it surprising that wildland is the largest piece here at 38%, followed by residential at 29%, as well as vacant warehouses at 10%. So it's not an insignificant issue for the firefighter themselves. The statistics for fatalities and injuries are not standardized in any way. There's a number of different agencies that collect this type of data, ranging from the National Wildfire Coordinating Group, U.S. Fire Administration, National Fire Protection Association, and several others. But none of them count the fatalities or the injuries in the same way, okay? So it's actually very difficult to track these in some ways. On the right-hand side of the slide there, you see the NFPA data plotted versus the Department of Interior data. And one thing you'll notice is that they never agree. In some years, they're 25% different from each other. So it can make it difficult to assess the impact if we can't even agree on what a fatality is. Another way of looking at the impact on firefighters is to look at the jurisdiction. Are we talking municipal firefighters who are working in the wildland, or are we talking wildland firefighters who are working there? And again, in this particular case, the green is the wildland firefighters and the red is municipal firefighters. You can see that in some years, like 1999, the majority of the fatalities in the wildland was actually municipal firefighters. And you can see here that it ranges from more than 25 to, in some years, only 8 or 9. Another way of looking at it, using the same NFPA data for a 10-year period, is to look where it's occurring on the fireground, or which is on the left-hand side, and then you have the right-hand side, which is responding or returning to. So on the fireground itself, single largest cause is still motor vehicles, followed by overexertion, and then caught or trapped. If we move to responding to or returning from, not surprisingly, the largest number is actually motor vehicles. Overexertion is still a significant component, returning to or responding to or returning from. Switching to a different set of data, on the left-hand side, this is approximately 21 years of data encompassing about 367 fatalities. They can be dropped into, 87% of those fatalities can be dropped into about 4 categories, with aviation accidents being the number 1 category, followed by vehicles and heart attacks and burnovers. If you look at a different set of data, which doesn't quite cover the same number of years from the Department of Interior, it looks like aviation is the single largest cause. This data is a little more recent than this data, which suggests that we're seeing more aviation issues recently. Burnover is still an important component, though, in both of these studies. So, impact of the wildland fires on society or the community itself. Again, the costs are continuing to rise. We're spending more money every year. If you look at the data plotted here, this is, I believe, from the 1960s. The yellow is federal, the blue is state, and the lowest one is local. And you can see that it was gradually growing between 1960 and 1990, and then it began to spike up. So in the years 96 to 2000, we were spending approximately $1.3 billion a year. Now, in 2001 to 2005, we're spending $3.1 billion a year on this. So the impacts are not only on firefighters, but they're also on communities. The costs are not only the cost of paying you guys to go out and suppress those fires, but it's also insured, uninsured. There's an interruption of business. There's a tax-based loss. There's infrastructure degradation, and there's also some ecosystems impacts such as soil erosion. There's there can be as many as 100,000 wildfires in a given year, burning about 7 million acres of land each year. Firefighters are doing an excellent job of extinguishing about 97% of these before they get more than 10 acres in size. So the vast majority of wildland fires are suppressed at a very early stage and very small. Those aren't the problem, okay? It's the other 2 or 3% that are getting into the wildland urban interface communities that are causing the cost, okay? There's 70,000 communities at risk in the United States of wildland urban interface fire. This represents some 46 million structures. In a typical year, we can lose 3,000 structures. Over the last 100 years, 6 of the 10 most damaging fire events have been WUI fire events, okay? So think about that. We don't often think of the magnitude of this issue, but it's a big issue. We estimated the cost in 2009 at being about $14 billion. Single events can be very expensive. A 2007 Southern California fire caused the evacuation of 300,000 homes and also incurred $1.8 billion in cost. So one of the issues here is why is it difficult to solve? Why is it hard? Well, part of it is that a lot of times in that remaining 3%, there's a linkage between the wildland urban interface and the local conditions, typically weather, fuel conditions, topography, to cause a high-risk WUI. These extreme environmental conditions can be high winds, such as the Santa Ana in Southern California, or if you have winds coming down off the Front Range here in Colorado. That low humidity, that hot weather can all increase that hazard. Again, fuel loading has been increasing, both structural as well as vegetation. The structures we're planting out there are a fuel load, as well as the natural vegetation. And there's issues with scale of fire, okay? You know, you go everything from a couple of centimeters being an ember to several miles or kilometers to even hundreds of kilometers for a fire line. So you're stretching from very small scales over several orders of magnitude to regional fires. And that typically means that you can't use the same tools to address it. The wildland fuels are different across the country. If you're in Florida with Tommy, who will be speaking in a few minutes, you're worried about the palmetto source, okay? On the other hand, if you're in Texas, buffalo grass can be a problem. If you move to this area here, it's the pines in Colorado. If you're moving out to California with Rick, it may be the chaparral. These are all different types of fuels. It's not the same fuel everywhere. So getting a little bit into the fire dynamics, just so everyone's on the same page again. Fire, it's basically a chemical reaction between fuel and oxygen that releases light and heat. This is the fire triangle, the basic fire triangle with heat, oxygen, and fuel. And you all know that in order to suppress that fire, you have to remove one of those components, okay? So you're either removing the fuel itself, you're removing the oxygen, or you're removing the heat. In terms of fire spread, there are three mechanisms that you can spread or you can transfer heat. One is conduction. It's transfer by contact. It's the least efficient, okay? Second one is convection, where it's transfer by contact with a hot flow. This is much more efficient. It's hot gas flowing past the fuel, or in some cases, it's the fuel moving in a hot gas environment. The most efficient is radiation. So transfer via electromagnetic waves. It is the most efficient in terms of transferring that energy. Now, you can have combinations of these, obviously. So you can have flame contact or impingement. You can have the thermal radiation, or you can have embers. How do the fuels influence the ignition and fire spread? Well, again, depending upon your fuel moisture, lower moisture typically ignites easier and allows that fire to spread. Fuel size, if you have small dimension type fuels, they're typically easier to ignite. If you have fuel continuity, which means that you have a continuous supply of fuel. If you have a road in the middle of a field, that grass fire may or may not jump that road, for instance. In a community, if you have a driveway or a tennis court, again, the fire may not jump that particular lack of that inhomogeneity of fuel. You also have vertical spacing and horizontal spacing as well. Another issue is ladder fuels, where you may have surface plants. Those surface plants could then ignite higher level plants such as chaparral, and then you could also ignite the canopy of the forest itself, and you have to be aware of that. How can weather influence? I'm sure that you're aware that the temperature, if it's extremely hot, can preheat that fuel. It can also generate currents. It can cause air currents to move up the sides of canyons. It can reduce that moisture in the air. Again, the relative humidity itself is defined as the amount of water vapor in the air. If it's absent, then it's easier to ignite. You see this also reflected in the fuel. Long periods of low humidity will pull that moisture out of the fuel itself. Wind can influence directly how that fire moves and the rate of fire spread. And of course, wind is unpredictable. Rapid wind changes can push fire onto firefighters in unusual ways. And some of the reports out of Yarnell indicate that there was an interaction between the wind and the fire that may have pushed that fire onto the hotshot crew. How can topography impact ignition and fire spread? Well, generally slope. The steeper the slope, the faster the fire is going to move up that slope. That's nothing new. That fire preheats the fuel ahead of it, makes it easier to ignite as well as spread. And you have that convective heat as well, moving that air up the slope. Again, it depends upon what aspect you're looking at. If you have a southern facing slope, again, that will receive more solar radiation. That could dry out your fuel. Usually on the southern aspect, you have lower fuel densities, things like that. So certain types of terrain can definitely influence or channel where that fire spread is going to go. Ridges and canyons can impact this as well. So how do we look at exposure for wildland-urban interface fires? Well, typically the source for a wildland-urban interface fire is always a wildland fire, okay? So that's your original source. It can be anything from vegetation, and I listed the 3 different types of vegetation there. And it's going to be impacting a community, which is depicted here as these red arrows. And it can be either flame or it can be embers, okay? Sometimes urban firefighters forget that the embers are an issue. Wildland firefighters are very aware of spotting issues. But sometimes urban firefighters are not as experienced with the ember spotting. So what you're setting up here is, this is your source term, produces a lot of flames, a lot of embers, and your community is your target. That's how it starts initially. So your targets down here may be a structure or some vegetation or a vehicle, something like that. However, once that fire has ignited that community, then the scenario changes a little bit. Down here in your community, some of these targets now become sources. So now you have to worry about embers from the structures. You have to worry about thermal radiation from the structures. You have to worry about embers from the ornamental vegetation. So the situation can change here. Your original targets may also become sources. And this is something that's unique to wildland urban interface fires. So how does one attack this? Okay, we've developed what we call an exposure scale. The exposure scale is designed to quantify that intensity or that exposure. This is not an original idea. Back in the 30s, they came up with the Richter scale for earthquakes. It measures the energy involved in an earthquake. Again, in the 70s and the early 70s, they developed both something for hurricanes, the Saffir-Simpson, as well as the Fujita-Pearson scale for tornadoes. And you're familiar with like an F5 or an F4 in a tornado, or a different classification of hurricanes. Well, we're proposing the Wildland Urban Interface Hazard Scale, which is an attempt to understand the exposure that one might find in a wildland urban interface fire. And what the exposure scale is designed to do is capture that exposure, looking at the fuel configuration, the weather, and the topography. And it combines those, and then if we can understand what you're going to be exposed to, and that can be a structure or that can be a firefighter, okay, what you're going to be exposed to, then we can develop more representative tests so that we can improve the materials for structures or we can improve the protective gear for firefighters. And we believe this will, once the materials and design are incorporated into the building and fire codes, then that will reduce the losses due to this. Now, as one implements this code, I don't know if you can see it here, but on the right-hand side, you have a community with some different colored zones. On the periphery of the community here, which is colored in red, they might be exposed to flames as well as embers. And you might have to design your combustible exterior, the way you design the buildings, your vegetation, to accommodate that. On the other hand, if you're in the interior of this particular community, you may not see the fire itself. You may see the embers. So you may be able to use less fire-resistant materials in the interior of a community as opposed to the periphery of a community. And so that's where you're balancing what the exposure is to how much fire resistance you need to put into it. So the way we approach this technically is we have a matrix which has 3 different axes. One is wildland fuels, topography, and local weather. So if you look at one of these subcubes here, for instance, this cube here is low wind. It could be flat, and it could be something like grass, okay? That represents one exposure. It may not be a particularly intense exposure. On the other hand, if I move over to here where I may be on a ravine, I may have a lot more fuel, and I may have high wind. You may have to actually address that with more fire-resistant materials. That's how we're beginning to fill in this cube. And I should point out that because embers, our post-fire analysis indicates that about 50% of the ignitions are occurring from embers, okay? Sometimes firefighters think that it's the fire line sweeping through the community that causes all the ignitions. This is not what we're seeing in our post-fire analysis. So in order to account for this, each of these smaller cubes is divided into either embers or fire. So there's a similar one that we developed for the community fuels because, as I pointed out earlier, these are the ones that start out as being the targets but then become the sources. So what one does, and we're not very far along filling in this cube yet, is, and I don't know if you can see it, but these cubes all have different ratings in them, E1 through E5. Now, E4, again, might be a structure on a ravine where there's heavy fuel and is prone to high winds. That might represent the most severe exposure. And then we have others where you may be in North Carolina, where the fuels are always moist. You don't typically see high winds. You may not have a lot of fuel load. So in those cases, you may not really actually have much of a WUI exposure. So we then fill in these smaller cubes, both in terms of embers and in flame. A chart which sort of lists some of these, for instance, an E1 zone might be no ember exposure, light fuels or a wet environment, and low and moderate humidities with light winds. Okay? How you design your structures or your communities in an environment like that may allow you to use more wood, for instance, and different types of vegetation, maybe closer spacing. On the other hand, if you go down to like an E3 where you may have significant ember exposure, that may translate into non-combustible roofing. You may have intermediate fuel loading, meaning that you have more wildland fuel. You may be on a moderate slope, and you may have strong winds and low humidity. In those cases, you may be finding yourself using very fire-resistant materials, not only for the roof, but for the exterior. You may have significant needs to use low ignition or no vegetation at all. So you design your structures to the exposure that you're expecting to see. So in a way, what we're trying to do is harden the communities. Okay? In urban fires right now, there are certain things built into this room, for example, where if a fire got started here, because there's certain fuel properties in the furniture, in the wall, and other things, the fire is still likely to be in this room when the fire department shows up. Okay? We don't have that in the WUI community. What we have in the WUI community is things that are easy to ignite, and they burn really quickly once they do ignite. Okay? So the goal here is to harden the communities, to make them harder to ignite, and if they do ignite, they don't spread the fire as quickly. So as we do that, we couple the exposure to the construction, and so from the exposure scale, the most severe translates into the most resistive fire, and no exposure or very little translates into much less restricted flow construction. Now, the goal here is not to tell you where to build, okay? If you live in California, you have earthquakes, you still build homes, you still build things. You just build them better and more intelligently. That's all we're trying to do here, is we're not saying you can't build it there, we're just saying if you build it there, you need to use different designs and different materials depending upon your exposure. So again, this is another, this is a blow up of it where in this particular case, this is a Southern California fire where the winds were coming from the upper right down to the lower left. And these are not, this is just an example. So again, you have areas on the periphery of a community which may need to be resistant to flames as well as embers, okay? But as you move to the interior, you may not need the same level of protection for flames because when the fire line moves into the community, it typically will slow down and get less intense. So why haven't we solved these problems? Is it an issue of controlling wildfires? So one could argue that without wildfires, there would be no WUI fires. That's true. If we were able to put out every single wildfire, we wouldn't have any WUI fires. We'll call this the suppression or wildfire control approach. But if you've got 100,000 ignitions or 100,000 fires, it's pretty hard to believe that you're going to be able to get every one of them out. Is it an issue of igniting a single home? Okay? Even if the home is in a WUI environment, single home ignitions are handled very routinely by fire departments. Few issues there. Is it an issue of igniting multiple homes simultaneously? That's the difference, okay? Multiple ignitions with rapid fire spread overwhelm the available resources in many different ways. So this gets back to we need to harden the communities. We need to slow down the ignitions, and we need to limit that fire spread if they do ignite. So we'll call this the structural ignition prevention approach, which is what the exposure scale is working towards. So improving that overall fire resistance of the WUI communities. So again, as I mentioned earlier, WUI fires have both embers as well as flame radiation and convection. You have a range of wind conditions, humidity, terrain, vegetation. We don't understand all this yet, okay? The scientists haven't caught up. The limited understanding of the science in ignition and fire spread. Again, we started doing some serious science in urban fires back in the 70s. We've only been working on WUI fires for about 5 years, so we're a couple of decades behind, basically. So, but we're working to catch up on that. There are no proven wildland urban interface firefighting methods, no national best practices for WUI firefighting. You have wildland firefighters, you have structural firefighters. We really don't have any WUI firefighters, okay? And it's important. You can't fight a WUI fire, which tends to be distributed ignitions, the same way that you fight a single structure fire. So we have, because we don't have a lot of science underneath the WUI fires, there's not a lot of science in the building and fire codes. Many of the fire codes actually don't include embers at all. And if you believe our post-fire analysis, you're missing half of the ignitions. So you're not going to be able to solve that. So NIST hosted a workshop in Boulder, California, actually 1 year ago. And what we tried to do was pull together a number of the stakeholders, okay? So we pulled in, the fire department, we pulled in the standards development organizations, we pulled in CAL FIRE, Rick participated. We also pulled in the industry. We need to have their input as well. And we took a look at the current research that was being done by like IBHS down in South Carolina or the Forest Service. And we also presented our exposure scale for the first time. So with that, the way we approached it in the workshop was, first of all, what are the issues right now? What are the shortcomings, okay? Why aren't we more effective in preventing the ignition and limiting fire spread? We then went back and developed ideas as to how we could approach those. We then prioritized which ones we thought would have the most impact. And then we identified who should be working on these in a roadmap. So I don't know if you can read this, but this is the prioritized WUI research needs. Now this is not wildland research needs. This is not urban. This is wildland urban interface needs. And the first one was hardening the structures. The second one was specifying performance standards. The manufacturers kind of surprised me because they said that if we had a representative test, then they would work to make their materials meet it, okay? So sort of summarizing this, the top 5 were hardening building structures, specifying performance standards, making them representative, understanding the ignition phenomenon, educating the stakeholders, fuels management, improved tools for post-fire evaluation. Right now, typically when you collect data after a fire, you count the number of structures that have either been damaged or destroyed, okay? We've developed a standardized data system we'll call WUI 1, WUI 2, different levels of details, but when we go out, we collect data on everything. The houses that survived or the structures that survived actually contain a lot of information as to what worked. That's something that we typically don't collect. Our new data system allows that collection. We have resource limitations. We only have so many people, but we've developed a smartphone application. We're working with CAL FIRE to deploy that so that they can collect it on a smartphone. We have iPads, which is a little bit more sophistication, and we have tablet computers, which requires a couple of weeks of training, but with the tablet you actually pull up the plot, you can see the property lines, and every photograph you take is linked to that particular image. And with this data, we can then go back and look at and see things that we may not have been able to see before. So for instance, in the Trails fire, Southern California, the Trails community, it was the Witch Creek Gallido fire, we discovered that decks that ignited often spread to structures. Okay, you can either design the deck or use different materials or whatever, and maybe that will cut down on the ignitions of the structures. When we looked at the Amarillo fires in Texas, again, remember in Texas the fires tend to be grass fires, okay, buffalo grass, lower. Some of their structures are actually built on piers. And one of the things we identified was the fire was just simply running underneath the structure and igniting the structure. There's a different solution to that, okay, to prevent that fire from moving underneath of a structure. When we were in Waldo Canyon, looking at that, fences appeared to be an issue, okay? So these post-fire analysis, the standardized data collection of everything, can provide you with a wealth of information. And then as an example, when we got the information from Waldo Canyon that fences might be a problem, we then conducted some laboratory experiments. Now, initially we thought you'd have to have some type of combustible material at the bottom of the fence, either mulch or dried fuel or something like that. And the embers would then catch in that fuel and then set the fence on fire. When we did these tests in a wind tunnel, we discovered that the fences just caught the embers. You didn't need any fuel at the bottom. You could have bare dirt there. So again, this is not something that we would have expected. This is something that we learn from the post-fire analysis, and that allows us to then move on to improve things. So, and the last item here was improving the effectiveness, resources, technology for the attack of the fire itself. So as we understand the exposure, we'll better be able to provide insight as to what tactics may work, what tactics may not work. For instance, if a fire department is protecting a community by pulling its lines to the periphery of the community, charging those lines and waiting for the fire line to come on them, okay, as the fire comes closer, they look around behind them and they discover that there are structures on fire behind them. Okay, their lines are charged, they can't drag them. It's a case where the embers are setting the fires behind them. So it may require different tactics where you prepare for those ember ignitions. As well as the fire line. So this is just a snapshot of one of the roadmaps. So we felt it was important to go ahead and say that, for instance, what are the priorities? What are the major tasks? We assign times. We assign metrics to know how we would have success. And in a piece that you can't see, we actually said, well, who should be doing this? Should it be a research thing? Should it be the fire department? Should it be the National Fire Protection Association? That report is available online if you want, and it is one of the links that Rick listed on his list there if you'd like to take a look at it. So basically, in summary, the WUI fire problem is going to continue to grow. At this point, we have 46 million structures in 70,000 communities across the United States. This is a huge problem. We've built out between 10 and 15% of the available WUI. So we're going to continue to build out into the WUI. Let's build a little smarter. There are no WUI-specific firefighter tactics or equipment, okay? In terms of WUI fire dynamics, it's an extremely complex scenario. Back in the 70s, when we first started doing research, we thought it was complex to look at a fire in a room with 4 walls, okay? With all the different fuel combinations, the ignition, and everything like that. Well, you take that, you add weather and you add terrain to it, and that's what you have in WUI. So it's far more complex. You have to consider both the flame contact as well as the embers. And again, you have to deal with the fuel configuration, the weather, and the topography. And I think with that, I'll turn it back to Rick.
Thanks, Nelson. While we're doing the transition between speakers and stuff, just wanted to kind of point out to you that these things, this WUI phenomenon, while I said before, it's not new. There's nothing new to this. We've seen it for a long time. Research is just now coming out. State of California, the state fire marshals, they've come up with some very stringent code enforcements for building in the WUI environment. So this is the type of research that we're going to be doing, and it's going to be looking forward to hopefully in the future. So coming up next, we have Tommy Price. He's the president of Local 20. And as I said before, he's the Florida State Fire Service Association's Local S20. Tommy's a fire instructor, wildland fire instructor for Tampa Fire and Hillsborough County Fire, and program administrator for fire in the field in Hillsborough County. And looks like we're getting going. Tommy's also a training officer and been part of some of the teams that have come back west here. Tommy's from the state of Florida, and Tommy, go right ahead.
Can you guys hear me okay? Good. I'm a little bit different than some of these guys. This is the first time I've ever done this, so bear with me here a little bit. And I kind of like to get everybody involved with this, so I know it's kind of quiet. So we're going to talk about a lot of things here. Short presentation on training. Everybody's different from Alaska down to California, from Florida, so I just wanted to kind of cover some of the basics. And some of your fire departments might already do this, some of them might not. As Rick said, I am a wildland firefighter out of the state of Florida. My union covers roughly 500 of us that work for the state agency there, the Florida Forest Service. We are strictly wildland firefighters. We, in Florida, we're required to be both structure and wildland trained, but once we get through with our structure training, we never look back. I haven't worn an SCBA in 13 years. We do, most of our attacks, our initial attack is going to be with a tractor plow unit. The way I started out with this is 13 years ago when I got in the fire service and I started with the agency. You know, prior to that in the military, I was training's power. You know, knowledge is power. So I kind of wanted to get all the education I could, and that's kind of how I started out. And like Rick said, eventually I got into a national training specialist position. I've been all over the nation as a training specialist, which on an incident, that's the guy that makes sure you guys get trained and everybody gets trained and gets certified to NWCG standards. So let me figure this thing out. First thing I want to do is talk about different types of agency standards. Everybody's different. In Florida, just because that's what I know, we require all of our structure guys to do a minimum of 40 hours of wildland training, and that's something that's probably happened in the last 10 years. Our basic firefighter programs now consist of 130, 190, L180, and then the PRACAP stuff. And I was just curious, some of you guys, do any of your states have the same, or any of your fire departments have the same requirements, anything like that? That's one of the things that I learned being an instructor in Hillsborough and Tampa area, is that, you know, a lot of times the structure guys didn't really want to learn urban interface, just like my wildland guys don't really want to learn structure. But as we talked about here, the urban interface, we're starting to where we have to learn more and more. So back in Florida, they proposed legislation that actually required it for all firefighters. So just out of curiosity, I was curious who else does that. The National Wildfire Coordinating Group, we're going to talk about a training overview, some of the classes they offer for that. I'll talk about that. Also, some of the training resources that are available for you and some online training. We'll talk about that. And then one of the biggest things about training that a lot of fire departments and a lot of wildland agencies fail to realize is they need to train the public on this. And we kind of hit on that just, you know, a little bit as far as what they can do to make a wildland urban interface fire, you know, better off for them. Hopefully you can read these. Just a little overview of the NWCG training. The basic wildland firefighter training is S130. Is there anybody in here that's never had S130 training? Okay, good. S130 is a basic wildland firefighter training. Most of you guys that have had it know what it talks about, but the curriculum includes, you know, basic suppression tactics. In that class, they cover, you know, how to cut hand line, how to deploy different types of hoses. One of the biggest things about it is the LCES, lookouts, communications, escape routes, safety zones. They also cover the 18 watch-out situations and the 10 general firefighting orders for wildland firefighters. It also has a whole unit, Unit 14, that's dedicated strictly to the wildland urban interface. I teach this to a lot of structure guys, and I can tell some of them are there just for the fact of getting a check in the box, which is okay. So I try to stress to them those three things: the LCS, the 18 watch-out situations, and the 10 firefighting orders. And if you guys have a chance to go back to your departments and teach S130, you know, I would focus on those things. There's a lot of good information in the course, but those, you know, all have to deal with safety and firefighter, you know, preventing firefighter fatalities. S190 covers a lot of the stuff that we just covered, but it's basically an introduction to wildland fire behavior. You know, it talks about our fuels, it talks about our topography, it talks about our weather, and how they have a role in the urban interface, how they have an effect on wildland fires. And once again, it's just a basic class to understand, you know, what that is. A good example in my area, the Tampa Bay area, you know, every afternoon we have our sea breezes. So, you know, a lot of structure guys don't realize that, so when I teach them that, they're like, oh, no, that explains why the wind changes every afternoon at 2:30, which will have a big impact on your local wildfires. Part of the S-130 course is the L-180, which is the human factors on the fire line. It discusses the human aspect of wildland fire and provides a mental toolbox for firefighters. It talks about leadership. It talks about, you know, the decision-making process. Situational awareness is a big part of that course. All these courses are stuff that you guys can take back to your local stations, local departments, and say, hey, this is something we can do. Real good courses. The S215 class, it's fire operations in the urban interface. It's recommended for all wildland firefighters and structural officers. One thing about S215, it requires both an instructor from the wildland side and the structure side. So we teach this down locally. It's a good class. It covers situational awareness, sizing up the incident, structure triage, you know, firefighter safety in the urban interface. Has a lot of good information. I believe it's a 3-day course. It's pretty good information. Some additional training that the NWCG has. All these trainings that I just covered, S130, S190, you know, and L180, those are the basic classes. In my opinion, I believe anybody that's ever going to have to deal with a wildland fire should know those. And that's something you guys can go back and research. I'll give you some of the links here. But, you know, it's a good basic concept for every firefighter. But all those have advanced classes, you know, the S131, which is an advanced wildland firefighter class. It's also required to be a squad boss on a hand crew. S230, which is our crew boss. S231, which is wildland engine operations. You know, how to learn the engine, be the engine boss. A lot of structured departments like that. I teach that one quite a bit. They want to come out and they, you know, how do they deploy the wildland engines? One thing we've started doing in Florida for our structure guys is I'm a dozer operator. I'll get a piece of property somewhere from a private landowner or a county, and I'll go out and build them a course. You know, a lot of times I'll go in and I'll put our containment lines, but then they're like, well, how do we get our hoses out there? So, you know, we'll build them roads, and a lot of structure guys, nothing against it, but they don't know how to drive, you know, off-road. So that's one good thing that we do, and, you know, we go out and we'll build them a course and we'll have them drive it, you know, and they usually wreck their trucks, and then we end up having to help them pay for it, but that's all right too. You know, S290 is the intermediate fire behavior class. It's just more advanced training on the fire behavior. 270 air operations. It's real good. You know, wildland urban interfaces, you're almost guaranteed that you're going to have a helicopter show up. You're going to almost guaranteed you might have air tankers, a seat, single engine air tankers, little small crop dusters basically is what they look like. You know, so it's a good idea to understand air operations and know what the capabilities of those aircraft are, especially if you're going to be the one on the ground talking to them. Obviously, the ICS courses, you got your I-100, 200, 300, all the way up to, I think, 420 now is how they go up, or 520. And then the G-GAP courses are something that's relatively kind of new in the last few years. It's basically the structure side are starting to make their own courses for these wildland classes to make them, you know, work for you guys. FI-110, that's the wildland fire observations and fire cause and origins, basically what we call it. One thing that I have to stress to the guys in Florida, in my local area, a lot of times, you know, we have to worry about scene containment and everything else, but more and more investigation process is becoming an issue on the wildland fires. You know, how did this fire start? Somebody's wanting to know who they're going to be able to blame, but more importantly, who's going to be paying for it. So the fire cause and origin is a good class that I think every basic wildland and structure firefighter should know. Then you have the S200, which is an initial attack incident commander course. It's a good course. It's basically for those first arriving units, just helps them information with scene size up, you know, firefighter safety, and it kind of gives them, you know, an idea of how to take over that initial attack on that fire. And then S244 is a field observer, basically for your lookouts. That's a pretty big deal, especially out west. You know, a lot of times you guys have the ability to see the whole picture, the whole train of what's going on with an incident. Unlike us flatlanders in Florida, you know, a lot of times my lookout will be me running a ladder truck up and saying, "Hey, Chief, watch for me," you know, and so it's good for every basic firefighter to know that stuff, so they kind of have an idea of what's going on. The Field Manager's Course Guide, it covers all wildland fire training courses and requirements. You also have the PMS 310, which covers all the different wildland positions and recommended training for those type. The way I look at it, like I said, knowledge is power. So what I started doing is I take that Field Manager's course in the PMS 310, and they're on my desk, and whenever I'm not doing anything else and I have downtime, that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at those things and saying, how can I get this training? So just an idea. I have a lot of structure guys that have realized that, hey, this is a good tool. I can start doing it. And we have links available for those on the NWCG website. Some of the wildland urban interface training resources. NWCG trainings are taught by many different wildland fire agencies. You guys, I kind of stuck in Florida, but in Florida, the Florida Forest Service teaches a lot of these training classes. A lot of NWCGs. Do you guys have agencies back home that teach wildland training? Yeah? No? Maybe you do and you just don't know it. So that might be something you want to go back and look at those local Forest Service offices. A lot of land management agencies will teach these. So I would definitely check into it. The federal land management agencies, state forestry, and conservation agencies teach these. Private companies, in Florida we have a lot of timber industry, and those private landowners are starting to say, hey, we'll teach the fire department because it's saving them money if we start saving their property a lot quicker. Obviously, local fire colleges, and then any other places you guys think you can get. Anybody else have any other places that teach these wildland classes that you know of? No? You just don't want to say anything? That's cool. I understand. I've been there. All right. You can't really see this link too good, but it's on your paper there. It's the nationalfiretraining.net. They have a lot of, NWCG offers a lot of wildland training all across the nation. They offer these courses. A lot of times they're pretty low cost. I know from my agency, the hardest part about it is getting them to fund me going out there. So, being the IFFF, it might be something that you can, talk to your local about and get some experts out to this training. Some other online training websites that we covered was the nwcg.gov. They have a lot of FEMA starting to get a lot more involved in the wildland fire classes. I haven't really explored those too much. And then obviously the U.S. Forest Service is starting to offer more and more online training. So we put some links on that handout, and you'll be able to go back and look at those later and see what kind of training is available. Some of the training I've talked about, most of the training I've talked about has prac app stuff. Like a good example, the S-130, we have a whole last day I dedicate to the practical application. And that's where we do our fire shelter deployments. We do our cutting the hand line, which all my structure guys love that one, where I pull out the hand tools and say start cutting fire breaks, and no, I don't think. But anyway, we cover that one pretty good. And then so some of those have the field training days, some of them don't. Some of them are starting to go where the course is completely online now. So definitely check into those. Last thing I want to talk about was training the public. There's a couple of programs out there, and I think we talk about these more later on, but the Ready, Set, Go program, basically it's designed to help the residents be ready with preparedness and understanding, be set for situational awareness when the fire threatens, and then how to go. That's programs that you guys can do back in your local communities as far as, what happens when the wildland urban interface fire starts affecting them, so they kind of have a preparation plan. And then obviously the FireWise, it's an NFPA created program for communities and firefighters to identify potential hazards in the urban interface, provides risk assessment tools, grants for communities for hazard reduction, stuff like that. FireWise is been around for a while, but it's not really a big thing, and it's definitely something, it's a tool that you have for your communities back home to go and check into. And there's links available on the handout. But in a nutshell, it's training. No firefighter should ever go a day without training, something new on the job. Wildland, if that's something that you have to deal with, I would definitely recommend, start learning more and more. Most of your fire chiefs, and they'll love it if you say, hey, we want to do a class, they'll help you find it. So we're going to hold questions till the end, I believe, but thank you. Any questions right now at all while we're transitioning? Good, all right.
Yeah, there's a little bit of time if you guys have any questions on some of this stuff. They're just, biting things on it. So, but now what we want to do is we're going to transition into a little bit of the pre-planning and the ideas of pre-attack. And Joe Larson is from CAL FIRE, San Luis Obispo unit there, and through his Cal Poly research and working with CAL FIRE in San Luis Obispo, he's been part of a team that's put together some pre-action plans and pre-attack plans and prioritizing some of our vegetation management programs and projects on protecting communities and outlining some of these pieces. Well, what's going around right now, one of the maps, you'll be able to talk about that a little bit more, And there's a link, and I'm going to walk around the paper here in just a second. There's a link on there that can actually take you right to those things and links to various pieces on there. Like I said, Joe is a research analyst with a GIS specialist, and this is a new, not a new phase in coming, but this is what we need to start looking at, and we start bringing our technology into these things. We start putting our GIS technology along with our mobile technology, and we should start becoming a more modern fire department, especially when it comes to the WUI and the wildland. So Joe, if you're ready.
Check. Thanks for the introduction, Rick. So one thing I don't want to assume is that you all know what GIS stands for, and it's Geographic Information Systems. And basically, it's just mapping. And I got the luxury of passing out the pretty maps, which I hope everyone likes. So once again, about myself, currently my title is Research Analyst, and then in parentheses they wrap GIS. But I'm basically just a GIS technician, map making guy for the fire service. I do have experience as a wildland firefighter for the U.S. Forest Service. I worked a handful of seasons on hand crews throughout California and the different national forests. While I was getting my forestry degree at Cal Poly, I was also doing some firefighting. And when I'd get the maps handed out at base camp, I was like, oh, this is cool. I'd like to be able to do this. So then I started getting into GIS, and I got a minor while I was doing my forestry degree. Currently, I work for a pre-fire engineering captain, and he's my supervisor. So he's kind of got that, experience to guide me in the direction to meet the needs that we have. And so it's good to work for him if, he needs to directly speak with some customers of ours. He can get their needs and speak the language a little better than a tech weenie like myself. Before I came around, GIS and map production was done in-house. And like my boss always says, if you could send an email and it would go through successfully and not get kicked back, then you were deemed tech worthy. And so then you needed to learn how to do GIS. So now that I'm around, it's more of a trained professional as far as GIS and map making goes. So that's really benefited our unit. So we're going to talk about some of the different components from the GIS and pre-planning piece of the puzzle. And what's involved with that is really just intel, data, different analyses you might run, different, whether it's behave or some fire models, or maybe you're looking at winds and what they do in a certain canyon. And then, those go into what your plan is going to be. And, attached right next to that plan, it's great to have maps. Everyone likes those. It's great to be proactive about that. So when you do have an incident occur, you can just lay down that map that you've made ahead of time on the hood of the vehicle and start working. This little picture here is a sample from the Park Hill pre-attack plan, and that was really the first WUI area or project that initiated this whole process. And since then, I don't have a count on the number of plans that we have, but all those different ones around there are different high hazard areas in our unit. So how that starts is with an identified need. Typically that's going to be a potential high hazard area, and then work on developing your plan. You want to build on past experience. That might be obvious, but maybe you have had a scare in a community and you can build upon what that fire did. Is it going to act a certain way when it hits a certain fuel type? Do you have some local winds that you can count on, changing that fire behavior? And as you develop this plan, you need to use existing standards, NWCG or NIFC types of standards as far as terminology goes and map symbology. I mean, you don't want to be making up a new symbol for a safety zone, because if you have some people coming in from out of the state or out of the area, that's why we have those standards, is so that we're speaking the same language. So develop a clear plan that outside resources can use and understand. Funding, you know, there's various grant writing and receiving workshops here, and that's truly helped us out a lot. The plans are not cheap and easy to make, and so we've had to seek out funding with grants. We've also worked in conjunction with the Office of Emergency Services and the Fire Safe Councils to get a little money for these plans, because when it comes time to reproduce them and print them on that nice cardstock paper, it costs a little bit. So how do you get started? Well, you know, I talked about local knowledge. You know your hazard areas, and so, you know, be proactive about it and build upon that past experience on what you expect that fire might do, where your safety zones will probably be, the evacuation routes that you think the public will be following. In Park Hill, there's a lot of horse lovers, and so, you know, there's a horse emergency evacuation team, and they've got a plan, so we work with them to make sure that that information is laid out. So get out in the field. You got to collect some data, you know, use those GPS units, take a lot of photos, and start building your database. You know, build that big old folder where you're keeping all these things. You keep your maps and your waypoints and your tracks, and then validate and verify. You know, I've got a picture here of addresses, and as you can see on some of those plans, we've got all the residences and their address labeled. So you want to make sure that that's correct when it comes time to, you know, accounting for homes and evacuations. So some of the tools that were used to produce those plans, GIS software, Esri ArcMap is our go-to, is pretty typical. It does cost, I got that in small italics there. So if you think you're going to want to do something like this, these are some tools that you're going to need to plan, and if you're going to need to spend some money, you know, think about a grant or working with a partner that can help you acquire those tools. There are free solutions, however, and Quantum GIS is a free software program, as well as Google Earth. You know, that's a pretty easy one to use. I work with Phil very often, and he'll come in and tell me about a fire and where it was, and we can just real easily sit right there in Google Earth and draw it in a heartbeat, and then save it as a KML and send that as an email. Really quick, really easy. I think any of you can do it. So those are free. Free is good. And for the purposes of disclosure, full disclosure, when our final product for these is a PDF file, and we give that over to a vendor, and she, you know, she messes around with the layout design, incorporates the text, and she does all of that with Adobe Illustrator. So just so you know the whole picture there, these are the different types of software tools that we use to produce those. So I talked about the database, fancy word for essentially, you know, the folder where you're going to keep all your stuff. But all the text that are in those plans, it's just, you know, a Word document where we've laid out, you know, the different bullet points and text. So keep that organized. You might have various map products, like an overview map, or, you know, little sections that are focus areas for particular communities or intersections of roads. All that project data needs to be organized for reprints, legacy use. You might want to share that with your local county or city so that, you know, if they have some GIS folks, they can incorporate it. So keep all of that organized, especially for reprint. I mentioned the community of Park Hill. We went back 10 years later and reproduced that map product. Came out a lot nicer. You know, we had better imagery on the newer version. We did a better job of accounting for point locations with addresses. So try and keep that stuff organized. And then when it comes time to publish, definitely review that thing over and over and over. Sometimes we'll spend 2 months reviewing, getting different eyes on there, making sure that everybody's crossed their T's and dotted their I's. And then you got to make sure you have support. You're going to have other cooperators like local sheriff or police. Make sure that they take a look at that thing and that they're, you know, in with that. You don't want to go and produce something and then they finally see it when it's all done and say, this ain't right. So make sure that you have buy-in from the field and your cooperators. And then confirmation that, just confirm with stakeholders and authorities that they're good with that before you go and print it. So where's this headed next? I'm pretty excited about getting away from the printed product, but it's still a great thing to be able to hold in your hands. But what's exciting about moving to the web is that if we have a change that we need to make, that's going to be updated immediately using digital types of products. So mobiles and tablets are really where it's headed. Currently, with the PDF product that we have, you can use the Avenza app, which is for Android and iPhone. And this is what you'll see. You can see your position as a blue dot. You can drop different waypoints with Avenza, and it's pretty slick. And then you've got that thing you can hold as well. So I'm pretty excited about that. And then we're also moving to the web with a company called Mapbox, and that allows us to essentially just have this product digital, but what's great about it is it's dynamic. You can zoom down in, you can hover onto certain features and get information like land ownership, things like that. So if you want to see what that looks like, come hit me up. During a little break, I can show you what the digital product is moving towards. And like I said, that's what we're really excited about now, is to take this to the next step so that every person with a device can go to a web address, see that plan. It's dynamic. You can zoom, you can hover, it's interactive. And so we're really looking forward to that. So to wrap things up, first of all, if you have any questions, write this down. I'll answer all your emails. It'd be good to chat with you. And be proactive with pre-planning. You know those high hazard WUI areas, and you don't want to just be reactive when that occurs. So it may kind of be intimidating, though. I know that I'm in a minority of being a GIS person working for a fire individual. And so you guys might say, well, we don't have funding to hire new staff. Think about utilizing like local college kids. It looks great on their resume. They're all savvy with the newest technology, and you can, they don't cost a lot of money. So, put out a job announcement at the local college, and that's worked out well for us. We pull in interns from Cal Poly, and they get a little wage, but what really looks good on their resume is that they worked for a fire department, and it goes both ways. They've got those skills. They can help you produce these products. So consider that, especially in conjunction with your grant award money that you might have got. And then, make sure that your cooperators and stakeholders are going to buy in with that plan. And, that's what I got. So thanks.
Okay, folks, so we do have a little time for questions if you need to, but one of the things I want to kind of point out is you see where the progression is going in the WUI. We've talked about some of the research and a lot of the research with the embryo generation, those sort of things. You can see a little bit of that in a little bit on some videos that are coming up. But we talked about the exposure scale, and we're looking to how we're going to harden homes, and we're going to be able to put those into actual resources for the building community and for the planning folks. As fire department folks, we have fire marshals that are out there and doing these same sort of things with a code development in each county, in each community. We need to think about those from the very beginning. Now we move that into the training aspect of how we're going and where these things are moving forward to. This, like I said, WUI is very dynamic, and we're still learning these pieces that are going on. We have, as Nelson said, a fire in a building or in a house usually stays there. Fire in the wildland moves out, and it's very dynamic, and it's three-dimensional in almost all cases. But when you add the fuel model H, or fuel model 12, but sometimes like fuel model H, which are called homes, you add a very explosive dynamic with people and emotions and all those other things. And that's what the GIS starts coming in. It starts bringing the technology now back onto your engines. And if you have mobile data computers and those tablets and those resources available to you, you can now start bringing that stuff down to your level. And eventually you're going to start seeing drones flying over with real-time cameras and those sort of things, giving you a bird's eye view of what's happening. So any questions on where we've started so far and what we're looking at? What's going to come up in a little bit, you're going to see next, after the break, you're going to see how the fuel mitigation and how you start going and planning your community and planning projects to harden and pre-plan your communities before the fire hits, and how we marble and try to work those situations prior to. Then we're going to talk about an operations plan and where we can go in the preparation and evacuations and actual wildland firefighting in a WUI environment. So if you have any questions or anything right now we want to talk about? I'm standing between you and a break, and that's not a good spot to be in, is it? As the fuel mitigation portion of this WUI class, and again, the dynamics of WUI and how you set these things out. It's not just the event, it's the things from the start to the end. And so Justin White, and I have to apologize, Justin, I said Justin Smith in the beginning. Justin White is a captain at Colorado Springs here just south of us, Local 5. And Justin is a program manager for Colorado Springs Fire Department, the Wildland Suppression Division. He's finishing up his natural resources degree at Oregon State University right now. Justin is part of a community that has done an amazing program. I was able to watch the presentation that they did at NIST, and when we were doing the WUI priorities, and how they went about prioritizing. And these are some of the tools that you can use along with the GIS portion, looking at your fuels, looking at your issues that are out there, your target hazards, and then working directly with the department and other resources on how these things want to go. And he's also going to talk about some of the activities of where these fires come from and how they come through a community. You'll see a couple of videos here, very interesting pieces of stuff. So with that, Justin, it's all yours.
Thank you. In the interest of full disclosure, let me just start by saying that I'm not a fuel mitigation person. How many people here are from the operations side? Their primary job is operations stuff. Just about everybody. Is there anybody here that is a specialist on fuel mitigation? Because I'd like you to actually come up and give this program. When Rick called me to do this, it was interesting because I said, I'm an ops guy. What's fuel mitigation got to do with me? So I'm glad I accepted the opportunity to do this because it gave me an opportunity to dive into fuel mitigation a little bit and see how it actually does affect me. And that's what I'm going to try to show you here today is, fuel mitigation, if we can bridge that gap between fuel mitigation and operations, will ultimately make a more safer environment for our firefighters to work in. So let's go over some objectives real quick. Also, if I'm talking too loud, let me know. My wife says that I talk even louder when I'm drinking, and I haven't started drinking yet today, as far as you know. So if I get too loud, let me know. I don't want to be screaming at you. But what we want to do is refamiliarize ourselves, or familiarize ourselves, depending on your position, with the fire behavior triangle and how does that relate to our fire environment. We're going to define fuels. We want to bridge that gap between fuel mitigation and wildfire suppression. We're also going to discuss the science of home ignition. How is it that homes ignite in the urban interface? And we've had a couple people touch on that already, and we're going to get a little bit more in depth. We're going to introduce you all to Fuel Model 14. And then at the end, we're going to introduce to you some ideas on what's the most positive impact on fuel mitigation, both on our communities and on our firefighter safety. So let's start with the fire behavior triangle. It's different from the fire triangle we talked about earlier. When we talked about the fire triangle earlier, which was heat, oxygen, and fuel, if you remove one of the legs of the triangle, the fire goes out. With the fire behavior triangle, you can't just simply remove one of the legs. Okay, it's not as easy as just saying, oh, that fire's burning over there, so we're going to take that hill out of the way and the fire's going to go out. That just doesn't happen. We can affect the topography, but we just can't do it in a practical way that will affect fire behavior. Okay, but the topography itself lends to what the fire behavior will become. We have a hard time predicting weather, let alone trying to manipulate the weather. The only time I've seen manipulation of the weather work is on the Black Forest fire earlier this summer. Our county sheriff, Terry Makita, got in front of the people after our 2 days of hard firefighting and said, I want our community, I want everybody to go out and wash their car. Because every time you wash your car, it rains. And sure enough, the next 3 days, we had good wetting rain, and that's what put that fire out. So thank you to Terry Makita, and if you could teach me that trick, I'd appreciate it. But what we can do and what we can manipulate is the fuels. Okay, and when we think about fuel management, we think about vegetation management. But let's define fuels. What are fuels in a wildland arena or in the wildland urban interface? And just sitting down and thinking about, this is what I came up with. It's any combustible material that, when aligned with suitable weather and topography and other fuels, contribute to fire spread. And like I said, we can't really manipulate the topography. And we can't really manipulate the weather, but we can manipulate the fuels, because all those things in the fire behavior triangle are all interrelated. So if we have a steeper hill and higher winds, then our fire behavior is greater. And conversely, if we have a flatter slope and lesser winds, okay, we have a decrease in fire behavior, or low fire behavior. And it's the same with fuels. If we can mitigate some of the fuels, remove some of the fuel from the fire area, we can also control the fire behavior. Okay, so just like the slope, a flatter slope will cause lesser fire behavior, so will lesser fuel. So if we reduce the fuels in an area or mitigate the vegetation, we can affect the fire behavior. So that's what we try to do with fuel mitigation. So first we need to learn how we describe fuels. Okay, so when people come up and talk to you about fuels or describe a fire environment, how do they do it? So let's start with the basics. There's fine fuels and there's heavy fuels. The fine fuels are the grasses, and the heavy fuels are the bigger logs or the dimensional trees, things like that. And we talk about two things. We talk about live and dead fuels. Live fuels, we talk about fuel moisture. How much moisture is actually in that live plant? And for instance, here when we talk about ponderosa pines, we want at least 100% fuel moisture, preferably 110, 120, 130% fuel moisture within that plant, because it gives us a description or an idea of how available that fuel is to burn, how much energy it will take to cause it to combust and cause, again, the fire behavior. Now, when we talk about dead fuels, we're talking about 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000 hour fuels. Okay, that's how we relate to dead fuels. Now, when we're talking about that, a lot of people have this misconception that that's how long it takes that chunk of fuel to burn. But if you think of it in these terms, think of a 1 hour fuel, which would be, say, a blade of grass. It doesn't take an hour for a fire to consume that blade of grass. So what we're talking about with the dead fuels is how long does it take that fuel to come in equilibrium with the environment. So as we're going through our fire, our normal day, okay, right about noon, the temperatures are going up, the humidities are going down. That blade of grass, it takes an hour for it to catch up with that change in the environment, to come within equilibrium of that environment. So what does that mean to us? It means that that fuel is super dynamic and it's available more readily than any of the other fuels. Okay, if we're talking about 10-hour fuels, 100-hour fuels, 1,000-hour fuels, it's bigger picture, because we're talking about days, weeks, and months. So if you've had a long drought, like we've had 3-year drought here, your 1,000, 10,000-hour fuels aren't going to catch up to the wet weather we have recently, because it takes so long for them to come in balance with the environment. So we look at that and we try to figure out which fuels are more readily available. How has the weather and how is the environment making those fuels available to burn? The next is the arrangement. How are the fuels arranged in a particular fire environment? Okay, so let's take a hill. So if it's grass all the way top to bottom of the hill, the fire starts at the bottom, it runs up to the hill. We can also look at the arrangement. Maybe it goes grass, then shrub, then timber. So we get a little energy going at the bottom of the hill, it hits the shrub layer, gets some more energy, and then it hits the timber layer, and it's really got a lot of energy hitting the top of that hill. What if we turn it around though, to where we put the large diameter fuels at the bottom, then they move into the shrub and to the grasses. You won't get as much energy built up because of the large diameter of the fuel at the bottom of the hill. It'll move into the shrub, but then it moves immediately into the fine fuels. It's able to release all that energy because there's not as much fuel ready to burn, goes to the top of the hill and doesn't have necessarily the power. So the arrangement of the fuel on the hill can mean a lot to us. The next is the continuity. When we talk about continuity, we're looking at how continuous is the fuel in our fire environment. Okay, so when we're doing fuel mitigation and we're doing vegetation management, we want to break that chain of continuous fuel. Okay, and there's many ways we can do that, and we'll talk about that later. So if I line everything up, I've got my topography, a steep slope. I've got my weather, I've got wind driving it up the hill, but my fuel bed is a 10 by 10 patch of grass in the middle of a scree slope. I don't have a continuous fuel that will allow that fire to burn and create a bunch of energy and cause us a problem. So continuity is one of the other things we like to look at. Then we can get into some of the intermediate stuff, and a lot of the folks that are in the wildland arena use this to describe the fire environment we're working in. It's called Anderson's Fire Behavior Fuel Models. It's 4 categories: grass, shrub, timber litter, and slash. And they're broken down into 13 subcategories. What you try to do is look at a fire environment and describe what you're seeing. Kind of the misnomer with this is people will go, well, I'm in a 1, a 2, a 7, a 10, and they'll name all the different little pieces they see, but what this is designed to do is give you a snapshot of the most predominant fuel in a fire environment. So if you have a fire environment that's predominantly grass with a few trees in it, you may not necessarily call that a fuel model 2, which is timber and grass. You just call it what it is, the most predominant grass. Say knee-high grass, which would be a 3. Don't try to space it out too much because then it gets confusing. What this was actually designed for was to plug into computer fuel models, fuel behavior or fire behavior models, so we could better try to predict what the fire is going to do, but we've kind of brought it into a suppression arena to describe, hey, this is what we're going, and my past experience says, hey, a fuel model 4 is bad stuff. Okay, I'm going to have this type of fire behavior. So now let's define fuel mitigation. And again, I sat down, just tried to figure out what does it mean to me, okay, for the operations perspective. It's really any action taken to alter the fuel component within a given area with the intention of decreasing the potential or active fire's ability to burn. So what is it that we do in fuel mitigation that decreases the potential fire's ability to burn? Well, we limb up trees, right? We want to limb up trees, we hear about that. Or we move wood piles away from homes. We put defensible space around houses, which some will tell you is 100 feet and some will tell you it's 10. Okay, it depends on the program. So what we're doing is we're altering the fuel component within that fire environment so we can better dictate and predict what's going to happen in that area. So I want to take a look at 2 different fuel mitigation programs. One is CSFD's. I picked that one because I'm most familiar with it. And then we'll look at FireWise. What I don't want to do is compare them and say this one is better, this one is worse. That's not the point, but we're going to look at some of the features of the fuel mitigation programs and kind of see where the numbers came from, because I think you're going to find that they're a lot different than what we think. When we think of fuel mitigation, oftentimes we think, well, I have to have this 100-foot of defensible space, which is totally devoid of life as we know it. So all the way around the house, it's got to be pretty much paved, and then your home is safe. Well, that's not necessarily the case, and if we look at CSFD's requirements or recommendations, we see 10 feet cleared of all combustible materials. What are we trying to accomplish with 10 feet cleared of combustible materials? We're essentially creating a fire line around a house. Now, when we do wildland suppression tactics and we dig a fire line, what are we doing? We're removing the fuel in a certain area so the fire burns up to it and it can't burn anymore. It's the same idea with the 10-foot cleared around the house. We're using non-combustible materials, so essentially we've taken 10 feet, taken a dozer, and put a line around the house. So we've protected that house with a fire line. Next we say, no combustible plants, shrubs, or trees within 15 feet of the structure. If you're like me, you plant trees and then you walk away. And the tree grows up, oddly enough, and you water it, and the branches go out and they compromise the 10-foot cleared of combustible material because all your branches go over. So now we've compromised our fire line. So if we put within 15 feet of the structure, especially the low-lying shrubs and stuff, it won't compromise that 10-foot of fire line. Next, we ask you to prune branches 10 foot off the ground. Essentially, what we're trying to do is break that ladder from ground to crown, okay? Or create a vertical fire line so the fire can't travel from the ground up into the trees. If we keep it on the ground, we can deal with it. It's when it gets up to the trees, it's got a bunch of continuous available fuel, creating BTUs that we can't handle, that we shy away from the fire because it's a safety issue. So if we can keep the fire on the ground and we do that by pruning the branches up, we're a lot better off. Finally, I wanted to bring up character trees, and you only find this in CSFDs because it's so prevalent. Character trees are two things. They're non-native species, which for Colorado Springs, the native species are pinyon juniper, ponderosa pine, a little bit of mountain mahogany. We have some birch, we have some cottonwood in the wetlands, and then we have scrub oak, which isn't actually a native species, but it grows so readily there and is so prevalent now we consider it native. Every other tree other than those are considered a non-native species. And why is that important? Because the ponderosa pines and the aspens and the things like that that we have as native species are adapted to a fire environment. Fire has been a part of their environment for years and years and years, and ponderosa pine, for instance, has developed bark around the trees that allows it to be more fire resistive. Trees we bring in from back east or from other countries aren't necessarily as fire resistive, so they become part of the fuel problem. And if you think about an urban landscape, I mentioned two deciduous trees. I mentioned birch and I mentioned cottonwood as natives. Every other tree, and I'm thinking of maples and ash and things like that, are non-native. That's what covers our neighborhoods. So if you look at an urban landscape and you think about your communities, think about how many non-native, non-fire resistive species you have in your neighborhoods, which part of the fuel load problem. Also think about character trees. We call habitat trees, which are standing dead trees. And you keep them in your yard so the woodpecker has a place to pound and it's not on your house, or a squirrel has a place to live, or a raccoon can live in the base of it. So it's a place for wildlife to maintain their habitat. Well, what that is standing dead fuel. So you have a vertical fuel source that's measured in the 1/10,000 hour range, whatever it is, but understand that's going to be more relatively available because all of its surface area is touching the environment. Okay, so it reacts to the environment more so than a log would because a third or half of it is touching the ground. Only half of it is exposed. So it's more dynamic and more pliable within that environment and is therefore more readily available. Also, what you would think with character trees is you don't want them to fall over into your homes or across your fire line, your 10-foot clear, and it can also be a safety hazard for firefighters as those trees may fall during a fire event. So now we move on to FireWise, and again, FireWise, I want to compare the two. This is the national standard. It's very prevalent throughout the country, and again, we're not comparing them to see which one's better, but to see how they're the same and kind of figure out where we came up with this notion of the 100 feet devoid of all living material around our homes. So FireWise says we want a 5-foot fire line around our house, devoid of all combustible material. Again, they want to use plants that resist fire spreading, and both FireWise and CSFD have lists on their websites that say, okay, these plants are your more fire-resistant plants. They hold more water, they're fire adaptive, use them in your landscaping. We want you to space plants 30 feet apart. What does that do? That breaks up that continuous fuel bed so you don't have branches of trees intertwining, so we go crown to crown to crown. Okay, it'll catch a tree on fire. It'll be isolated torching because one tree can't catch the next tree on fire, so to speak. We ask you to cut branches that overhang the house, that's so it doesn't compromise the 5 foot of cleared area. And then they ask you to prune branches 6 to 10 feet off the ground, breaking that ground to crown ladder. So if we put them side by side, we got 10 foot and 5 foot, no combustible plants, trim the branches that overhang the house. So they essentially say the same thing, but they're a little bit different. But why is it so small? Why is it 10 feet and 5 feet? I mean, we were just talking about 100 feet of cleared space devoid of all life as we know it. The Mars rover goes across it. The fire can't touch your house. But why is it 10 feet and 5 feet? Well, two things. The first thing is we're not dealing with properties that are that big. Okay, an acre is 200 by 200, correct? Okay, so that's about 100 feet radius from your house, right, all the way around. Most people don't live on an acre, especially in an urban setting. We're talking about a 1/4 acre to 3/4 of an acre. So it's not appropriate for us as fire professionals to say, hey, you need to clear out 100 feet around your house because they're encroaching on other people's property. Okay, and some yo-yo will go out and clear 100 feet out, and it'll be affecting his neighbors on both sides and all around, and they're going to end up getting sued, but the fire department told me to. I'm just being fire-wise. Well, so we give you recommendations that fit into the smaller acreage or smaller lot size of an urban community. The second reason it's so small is because how homes burn. And we're going to look at this here in a minute, but it may not be what you think it is. So think about how you imagine homes burn in the Wildland urban interface. And we're going to go through this and see if you're right at the end. The first thing we need to talk about is some experiments that were done in Canada. It's the International Crown Fire Modeling Experiment. What this was is in the I'd say mid to late 90s, some scientists from all over the world got together and said, hey, we want to learn more about crown fire so we can better predict their fire behavior. So what they did is they got some black spruce forests up in Canada, closed canopy, and they set up some experiments, but it gave them a unique opportunity to see how building materials react to these crown fires. Now the trees were an average of 43 feet tall, so pretty tall, about right for black spruce. The flame lengths during the experience averaged 66 feet tall, so good sized flames. These walls were bare plywood and they were set up facing the fire, and they were placed 33, 66, and 99 feet from the flaming front. So what happened with these experiments, they did 5 of them to make sure they got consistent results. Well, the walls at 99 feet never got scorched. They showed no charring and they showed no evidence of pyrolysis. 99 feet is almost 100 feet. So now you know where your 100 feet got planted in your head at some point. But let's move on to 66 feet. The walls got scorched, but they never ignited. So they did show some charring, they did show some evidence of some pyrolysis, but they never ignited. And now we're down to about 30 yards. Now we move to 33 feet. The walls got scorched, but they only ignited from direct flame contact. 11 yards away, 66-foot flames. The walls got scorched, there was some charring, evidence of pyrolysis, but that pyrolysis didn't ignite until the flame touched it. So now you can see where a 10-foot buffer may be more of benefit to you, okay? Because 33 feet away, we're scorching the house. So the home is able to survive the big blast of flame. So how are these homes igniting? Well, we go to Dr. Jack Cohen, and I don't know if you guys have heard of Dr. Cohen. He's quite a character within the wildland arena. He's the guy we consider wrote the book on home ignition. Okay, and we're going to watch this, and you're going to see what he believes, or what the science tells him, ignites these homes.
When I show this picture to people, they're absolutely amazed that this can occur. First of all, we have the sense that wildfire, high-intensity wildfire, like depicted in this particular picture, absolutely engulfs and explodes houses into flames. And so when I show this, and by the way, let me just say that this high-intensity fire at its closest point is about 45 feet from this house. And let me also say that the photographer in this picture was feeling a considerable exposure to the flame. They were beginning to feel the pain that is accompanied by the exposure that produces injury. But that says nothing about what's going on with this house. So let's take a look and see what the house looks like after the fire. So the crown fire has spread through and the house is still here. And the house is still there not because fire suppression, fire protection actions were taken to keep that house from burning down. This house actually did not ignite from that fire. So where's the disconnect in all of this? Well, the disconnect is between what we feel as a person and what it takes to ignite this structure from flames. What we feel is pain and injury from exposures to heat that is considerably less than what it takes to actually even char wood. Let me give you an example. The exposure that will produce a second-degree burn on my exposed skin in 5 seconds takes over 27 minutes to ignite the wood. What that means is that I can get very burned from a fire and the house isn't even beginning to char. So what does that mean in terms of our perspective? Well, what that means is that we start paying attention to these big flames, which then produces our perception that, my goodness, how in the world can this house still be here with all that flame in the picture? And the reason is because the requirements for combustion that are produced by a flame like that are so much higher than what it takes to cause us injury that our perspective is personal. Our perspective is from our pain and injury, not from the requirements for combustion. So as it turns out, we are many, many times, more than 100 times more sensitive to pain and injury than what it takes to actually ignite this house. And that means we start paying a lot of attention to flames like this and not to things like firebrands. Firebrands that are extremely effective in igniting the structure from their accumulation and then slowly producing glowing combustion on the house that then produces flaming combustion if it sustains and eventually destroys the house, is out of our perspective. Our perspective is on what affects us, the big flames, the big heat that we feel that produces the pain that impresses us is not necessarily related to what it takes to ignite the structure.
Saying is that maybe it's not this big dramatic fire that we've got in our head that ignites these homes. Okay, so how does that maybe change, and you'll learn more about this later, but how does that maybe change your tactics? And if it's not the big fire, and he kind of alluded to it earlier, what is it that's igniting these homes? The majority of homes burned in a wildland fire are due to embers or fire secondary to the crown fire. Embers or fire secondary to the crown fire. So again, start thinking now how that should affect your tactics, okay, and how you can implement or apply those tactics to be more effective and more safe on the fire ground. So let's take a look at some of the numbers from the Waldo Canyon fire. This one just happens to be what I had readily available, kind of near and dear to my heart because I kind of lived through it. But we look at 347 homes burned. 8% of those homes, or 28 homes, were burned by flame front direct flame contact. What I don't think a lot of people understand that haven't been in this situation is the actual wildland event is very short. Okay, at some point we move from a grass and a twig driven fire to an urban conflagration where homes are lighting other homes. And they are lighting vegetation, which are lighting other homes. So the actual wildland portion is very small. So when we talk about these tactics later, and we talked about that there's, we haven't ever developed a WUI specific firefighter, I would say that you probably are a WUI firefighter by default because you could have these urban conflagrations started by a room and contents fire that's wind driven, these wind driven events. These just happen to be started by a wildland incident. Okay, so you could have a wind-driven room and contents fire lighting exposures as you go. So it would behoove you to learn some of these tactics. Anyway, so 16% of those were structural exposure. 56 homes were caught in the chain reaction of homes lighting homes. 54%, 187 of those homes, more than double than any other factor, were ignited by firebrands and embers. Okay, firebrands and embers that got into your landscaping. Firebrands and embers that got into your soffit vents. Okay, got under your wood shake shingles and ignited the home. 54% of those homes. Now conceptually, it's hard to think, how does a firebrand light a house? So I found a video on YouTube that kind of shows us and gives us more of a visual idea of how these firebrands or these firebrand storms work. Okay. So now we've seen how embers burn the homes. So I said to you a little bit earlier, the wildland portion of the fire is short-lived. So where are we getting most of these embers that are continuing to drive this fire, this urban conflagration? The answer is the homes, right? And so what I'm going to tell you now is kind of counterintuitive, but something we learned on Waldo Canyon, and it didn't take us long to learn, that we want these homes, once they're fully involved, to burn as fast as they can. So we lessen our exposure time to these embers. What happens to a fully involved house when we do what firefighters naturally do and take a smoothbore master stream and train it right into the middle of it? It creates embers, right? And so now we've created a ton of embers, and we still have the wind portion of the fire event going on. So embers go up, and we're adding to our fire problem. So if we let these houses consume themselves as fast as possible while concentrating on protecting exposures and reducing ember production, we'll reduce the time of the fire event. Okay? So we want to reduce that ember production. So let's go back and look at my definition of fuels. Any combustible material that, when aligned with suitable weather and topography and other fuels, contribute to fire spread. Any combustible material in the fire environment. Now, we've talked a lot about vegetation management. What haven't we talked about? What fuel have we not talked about so far in the fire environment in these WUI events? How about the homes? The homes themselves should be considered a fuel. Now, in 2007, 2008, when there was a lot of fires burning in Southern California, essentially from the Mexican border all the way up to the San Joaquin Valley, I took a strike team from Colorado to help out on the fires out there. And I talked to an incident commander named Rocky Opplinger, and I hope I didn't butcher his name too bad. And we're sitting around, I just happened to come in from the fire line, and we're sitting having dinner, and he walked in the tent, and, you know, where are you from? And we started talking about structure protection stuff. And he said, you know, Justin, here in California, we consider structures fuel model 14. Remember there was 13 we talked about earlier? Well, he added another one for me. And he said, those are structures, you know, and they always grow back, and they always grow back bigger than they were before. And I said, how true is that? You know, we're putting a lot at stake to save a material thing. We're putting lives in the line to save material things. Now, don't misunderstand. I'm not saying there's no place for structure protection. But what I'm saying is through fuel mitigation, through hardening these structures and using building materials, we can create homes that protect themselves in these fire environments. So we can go to safety zones, do a fire front following tactic, let the main body of fire that we know doesn't ignite the homes go through, and we come back from behind and put our efforts into the fires that do burn down these houses, which are the ember-driven fires and the secondary fire to the crown fire. Okay, so from an operations perspective, the greatest impact from fuel mitigation will be realized through manipulation of homes. Now, a lot of people have said to me, well, the homes in my community are 20 or 30 years old. They're already built. Okay, they're not going to change. Well, yeah, they're going to change because people are going to have to replace the siding. Have them replace it with cement siding. They're going to have to replace the roof, get rid of the shake shingles and make it a Class A roof or a metal roof. They're going to want to replace their deck, build into the codes retroactive things so when they replace that deck, they have to do it with non-combustible materials. So you can create a community full of homes that can protect themselves when it matters through that initial pulse that allows us to put ourselves in a safe position and then come back in and do effective firefighting on ember fires and fire secondary to the crown fire. So when we look at wildfire suppression, the primary means of controlling, containing, and ultimately suppressing a wildland fire is through the manipulation of available fuels. Through the manipulation of available fuels, it sounds familiar. It sounded just like the definition of fuel mitigation. Let's think about what we do to suppress a wildfire. We create fire line. We manipulate that fuel. Well, through fuel mitigation, we've built a fire line around the houses already of 10 feet. Okay? We can burn out operations. We can consume the fuel. Again, we're manipulating the fuel just like with fuel mitigation. Okay? We can wet the fuel. Okay? That changes the moisture of the fuel and doesn't allow it to burn as readily. The point is, these fire suppression tactics that we're doing, these structure protection tactics we're doing, like limbing up trees, going in and cleaning out gutters, moving wood piles, all that is fuel mitigation, except we're doing it 2 months ahead of time instead of 2 hours ahead of time. So you're doing fire suppression tactics when you're doing fuel mitigation project, you just have the luxury of time. You can do more if you have to do less, which is a weird concept, but if crews go in and they have less to do, they can spread their work out over a larger area, so they can do more when they have to do less. The primary weakness of any wildland tactic is that they take time. Okay, how long does it take to build a half a mile of line? Or how long does it take to remove all the combustible materials from around a house? Unless you work for CAL FIRE or out in California, I'm not getting the 30 engines I need to help me do structure protections at a moment's notice or on an initial dispatch. It takes hours. Helicopters don't come to me in a short amount of time. It takes hours. So if you on the front end with 2 months' time can take care of some of this fuel mitigation stuff, this structure prep, this wildland suppression tactic on the front end, you have the benefit of time, and you're ultimately making a safer fire environment for your firefighters. So this is a conference on safety. So let's tie this all back to safety. And we'll go to our S215 class, which for those that don't know is our structure protection class, essentially. And in that class it says using water to prevent fire spread in running crown fires with brush or timber fuel types is ineffective in relation to the fire intensity and exposes firefighters to undue risk. Exposes firefighters to undue risk. So we'll move on to our fire line handbook. When we talk about fire suppression versus flame length, we go to over 11 feet. The Crown Fire modeling experiment, the average flame length was 66 feet, 6 times what we're talking about here, and it says control efforts at the head of the fire are ineffective. We don't go to the heel of the fire to protect homes. Okay, we go to where the fire is going. We're going to the head of the fire. So you're putting your people in a position where their control efforts at the head of the fire are going to be ineffective. And we'll end on the 10th standing firefighting order. Fight fire aggressively, having provided for safety first. When you do fuel mitigation and you create a fire environment that reduces the fire behavior, you're providing for safety first. You're just doing it with the luxury of time. What are you going to do with that? How about that? Are you going to put people in front of that? We have example after example after example. Are you going to put people on that house? There's a reason those hot shots are where they're at. It's because it's not safe for them to be in front of those flames, especially knowing that that's not those flames that are affecting our structures. So we need to adjust our tactics to put them in a safer manner so they can go in and be more effective on the fire that does burn the houses. Okay? Fuel mitigation creates a fire environment that allows structures to protect themselves during fire events where direct attack on the fire is not possible. Just in the fires we've shown, the fires we've talked about, Waldo, Black Forest. Okay? Fires that are going to happen in your community, they're going to have the same type of these events, can be affected on the front end by doing some fuel mitigation and teaching your folks the proper tactics and the science behind it so they know how to fight these fires. So the bottom line is this: fuel mitigation buys you time. It buys time for the structures. It's like your kids. You teach them and you teach them and you teach them and you send them out on their own because you know they're going to get in a situation where they're going to need that experience and they can protect themselves. Okay, it's the same thing with the structures. build up your community, build up your structure so they can protect themselves just long enough for the fire environment for us to be safe to come in and make effective attacks. It buys time for experienced crews and inexperienced crews because they're better able to focus their time on a wider range of problems, fine-tune the fire environment, okay, and figure out safety zones so they can implement proper tactics to fight these fires. It increases safety by increasing the margin for error. Now, this is the one last video. It's about 5 minutes long. This is the Black Forest fire. There's a little bit of a backstory to it because a lot of fire professionals watch this video. This video is made for the communities, and they say, well, why don't they just go out and get the fire? Well, the backstory is it's about 6 o'clock in the evening. We had gotten our butt kicked all day. So what I asked this engine company to do is said, just let the fire come to us. Once it hits the edge of this perimeter here, put the fire out. We're going to bump it into a wetland area. We'll be anchored on both sides. We don't have to worry about it again. They don't have to expend a lot of energy fighting the fire. But what I want you to watch is this is a very well mitigated, fuel managed and construction managed neighborhood. Watch the fire behavior. Don't necessarily focus on the tactics, but watch the fire behavior that this fuel mitigated neighborhood creates, the fire environment that this fuel mitigated neighborhood creates that allows us to do this type of tactic.
The Black Forest fire is approaching this house that the strike team has been assigned to protect, and they are in position and ready to go to keep this house from catching on fire. You see that the fire is trying to creep up into the trees, but for the most part, this part of the fire was actually a creeping grass fire. Okay, the firefighter is now managing the fuels here by raking them up so they don't travel into the mulch area. And our crew is trying to do everything they can to manage the property here before the fire arrives. They want to make sure that if there's a gas grill out there, that gas bottle is not out. Here they saw some patio furniture out here, outdoor patio furniture, and so they're stacking it up here so it's not spread out all over the place and catches on fire. So they're stacking up in one area where they can protect that and make sure that the fire doesn't ignite that. And you see the fire starting to approach here. This is on the side of the house called the Delta sides. Firefighter is now standing, waiting for the fire to arrive to him. He's at the edge of the mulch, and where the grass meets the mulch, he's going to make sure the fire doesn't travel past that line. And he's keeping his head on a swivel and watching for the fire in all directions. Now you see the firefighter at the back of the house here. He's on the what they call the Charlie side again, and he's waiting on the fire to arrive to him. Smoke is going to be produced in lots of copious amounts, and you'll see the fire starting to creep to him, roughly at about, looks like about 6 inches every second. The winds are starting to pick up now, and you can see a few embers blow across. They're cold embers, but nonetheless, visibility starts getting poor. What the video can't convey to you is that there's a lot of heat being blown in towards that firefighter. As the fire and the heat are coming to him, he has his personal protective equipment on. He also has a heat shield, face shield that is on his face to help filter out the smoke and the hot gases that are coming to him. He's saving all his resources here. What we're trying to do is allow the fire to burn out all the fuel around the house and let it blow right on by, and then we don't have to worry about that reigniting. So we're saving our water resources for when we really, really do need them. And we're just protecting the deck here and making sure that this fire doesn't get into the mulch. Now you see that the fire is trying to travel up the trees, but the homeowner did a good job of trimming those trees back up to about 10 feet so the branches don't catch on fire, the low-hanging branches. Managing the trees like this will keep the fire from spreading into the crown of the trees, which is very bad. And now the fire is starting to burn up to the mulch, and then lots of smoke starting to be produced. I'm taping this from behind the hot tub on the back of the deck, trying to keep myself from having to be subjected to too much heat and mostly my camera. And the smoke comes and it's pretty much a whiteout. Now this is looking on the other side of the hot tub. I decided to move out of the way here. The firefighter is now applying a small amount of water right where the fire has met up with the mulch. The fire has now passed through and it's done exactly what we wanted it to do, and that is burn around the house and leave the house intact. I'm shooting now at an angle from where the fire did approach. So this is already burnt out area. So you can see how the wind is picked up. But this is how the fire traveled towards the house. I'm just trying to give you a perspective on how it did. And this, everything is nice and black here, and that's what we want. We don't want a bunch of unburned fuel here. And now the strike team is doing a little bit of mop-up action. Now we're using the water resources to make sure that the fire is dead out as it butts up against the mulch, because the mulch is very flammable, and that's not a good thing to have right next to your house, because the fire will wick right into the house and burn the house down. So the guys are on the Bravo side now, and they are pulling up their hose, and then they're going to do a walk around here in just a minute, 360 degree. But in the meantime, they're going to make sure that everything that's buttoned up to this mulch is dead out. And they will check that with the back of their hand. Make sure that it is cold and dead out. And that way we don't have to worry about this rekindling. They're loading up their hose and ready to move on to the next assignment, the next house to save. You can see that sometimes almost total whiteout, where you couldn't see over the hood of the vehicle, and yet the fire is burning up against the road. But they're moving on to their next assignment and ready to protect more structures.
So, we as a fire community are good at saying, if this happens to us, I hope we're ready. Or if this happens to us, will we be ready? We will be ready. What I would ask you to do is kind of change that mindset and say, when this happens to us, will we be ready? When this happens to us, we will be ready. You start getting ready for these events now through fuel mitigation, through community planning, through building construction techniques and hardening of structures. Do that stuff on the front end, and you're going to benefit your community more on the back end when it really counts. Thanks for your time. If you have any questions for me, feel free to ask them. And again, if I'm not a fire mitigation specialist, so I'll do the best I can to answer them, or I'll get the answers for you. If you want copies of what we use for our building codes, kind of as a framework for you, I wouldn't say that you should take and copy ours, because ours is specifically built for our community. You should design one built for your community. Just email me and I'll get those to you as soon as I can. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Appreciate it. And again, what we're talking about are the activities that we're looking at, and what things that are available to us before we get into an event. What we're going to start now is we're going to go into the event, and we're going to start looking at exactly what we're going to be able to do, and some of the new pieces that are out there, some of the folks that are out working on this stuff. And now I'd like to introduce Phil Veneras. Phil is a battalion chief in San Luis Obispo for CAL FIRE, and I've known Phil for many years, and he's been very involved in the WUI and the operational field. He's been on, he's an operations section chief, logistics section in planning. He was incident command, an IC on one of our CAL FIRE's Type 1 incident command teams. He now serves on as a deputy incident commander on one of our incident command teams too, which happened to be just activated this morning. And so, with California kind of burning and in the essence that we have here. So anyway, he's not going to run fast, honestly, and he's going to be here this afternoon also. So we've got him. I've got a captive audience for the day, so don't go too far. But Phil was instrumental in one of these new programs and one of the new pieces that are out right now, and it's called the Wildland Urban Interface, and it's going to be a text document that's coming out through FireScope, and we're part of the FireScope team. And these are some of the tactics and strategies that we can use in the urban interface And so, Phil, you ready to go?
I am. Yep.
Oh, okay, excellent. All right, here's Phil Veneers.
All right, good morning. So kind of how this started for us, CAL FIRE needed to put some stuff together. We, like a lot of other departments, are changing our demographics. We had a lot of new operators who were coming in, company officers that didn't have a lot of the skills that we had when we started. So our department put together probably 8 or 9, 10 people, interagency program, and said, how do we do what we do? Quantify what would you do, put it into a book so they can teach it in the academy. So this book that Swan talked about will be available. We're not selling it. It'll be free. We did it all on duty just so we could get that information out to our folks. And we tried to understand what it is that we've been doing naturally and then put names to it. So that's how we got to what we're at. What I'm going to be talking about is the leader's intent that CAL FIRE, that we wrote for our department and put out by our director. That document is here. I'll go through it for a little bit. It's not available online, so I did copy it. Trying to give a leader's intent statement for the Wildland Urban Interface to our company officers and our chief officers, both for initial attack, that fire that starts right now, as well as a long-term extended attack or major incidents. We want to talk about some of the terminology, because the stuff that we came up with, some of the stuff we made up, a lot of the stuff we just kind of figured out that we've been using and put definitions to it. That was picked up by FireScope and applied throughout the rest of the California. Probably better than 90% of what we came out with. So that's some new terminology. We'll talk about strategy and tactics, and we'll talk about an evacuation and repopulation plan that we're using now. So we have some consistency throughout the state of California in how we evacuate people and put them back together. So let's start with the leader's intent statement. What's a leader's intent statement? What's leader's intent? Do you know offhand? Nope. What's leader's intent from somebody? Leader's intent is a statement you're going to tell your employees so that when they walk away, they understand exactly what it is you want them to do, why you want them to do it, and what it's going to look like at the end of the event. We didn't invent it. We stole it from the American military. American military actually stole it from the German military from World War II. It was a way that they could send out forces out away from their command structure, and those forces that were out working would then go, I know what it is my boss wants. He gave me his intent. The situation that I see here is different from what he told me or she told me, yet I can still carry out their intent. I can still carry out their objectives, their strategy, and their tactics. So this is the leader's intent. And what we want our company officers to know is that when you're out there, you need to have continuous situational awareness. Now, that's another term that's been thrown out. A lot of people don't, hey, get your SA, get your situational awareness. What is situational awareness? Anybody cough one up? Situational awareness is something that we all should have. You, as structural firefighters, you have it as well. You look at a structure, you look at the smoke that's coming out, you look at the occupants that are already evacuated the building, you look at the time of the day where your water source is, you build a picture for that incident. That's situational awareness. We want the same folks to do that for Wildland. We want that same application. So continuous situational awareness, and you get that through look times 3 that we talked about earlier. You get that from fire behavior. We get that from experience. You get that from talking to old timers. That firefighter and public safety is going to be paramount. Oftentimes, we were putting people into situations that were unsafe, but they're protecting structures. So that automatically made it okay. That's not right. That's not correct. We're trying to fix that. That it's understood that the defense of those assets, and we call them assets because it may be a power plant, it may be a flume, it may be a lumber mill, it may be a commercial product, or it may be a house. But defense of those things is not going to compromise firefighter safety. So when we send folks out, firefighter safety and emergency worker safety and civilian safety is number 1 in our risk analysis. That containment strategies will be proportionate and will be in conjunction with the defense. So we're not going to defend structures and not protect, because we're not going to defend structures and not extinguish the fire, or we're not going to extinguish the fire and not defend structures. We're going to do it all concurrently. That the best form of structure defense, though, is to put the fire out. We have a very aggressive initial attack system in California, and I've been out of state a couple of times for firefighting. but I'm predominantly, obviously, going to be talking about California. Very aggressive. We're mandated to have 95% of our fires 10 acres or less, and so that's how we're built on, is a quick, aggressive initial attack. But our folks are told, put the fire out. One of the scenarios that we used to see, and we still see it every once in a while, is somebody will show up on scene, order 20 engines for structure protection, and then wait for the fire to burn out of the wildland to the structures. Whereas if they put those 20 engines on the vegetation, put the fire out, there wouldn't have been an issue with the structures. So perimeter control is the number one priority, and then pre-planning in the wildland urban interface has to occur. And that's one of the things that Joe talked about. And I work with Joe quite a bit as my GIS guy. And so what we'll do is we'll sit down, I'll look at a community, I'll look at a canyon, I'll look at a road, and we'll build a pre-plan after that. You guys have structure pre-plans, right? For your target areas, big buildings, small buildings, your schools. You have a pre-plan. You're driving down there, you're sitting in the right seat, you're pulling that thing out, maybe looking at your MDC. There's a hydrant on the A side. Here's where this FDC is. Here's where our HVACs is. Here's our entrances. Here's our hazmats. All that kind of stuff, right? Well, that's what my pre-attack plan does. So when I look at a community, I'll look at where I want my incident command posts to be, where my water dip sites are, where my staging areas are, where are the areas that I don't want to send firefighters in without sending a reconnaissance in first to make sure that it's safe to do so. Which roads can I put structural engines on? Which roads can I put wildland engines on? All that stuff's pre-planned. And then we have it in our mobile data computers. A lot of the guys have it on their phones, their iPads, or their Androids. We have the big maps that Joe showed out, so that when you bring a strike team in from Colorado Springs and you're there in 2008, I can hand out 5 of these things or 6 of them, each engine, and the strike team leader gets it. When I say, hey, here's your dip site, here's safety zones, here's everything that's all on that map. So you walk into my fire with all that information up front. So pre-planning is important. That we're going to take appropriate response based on leaders' intent. Appropriate response, we kind of coined that phrase because people are independent action or they're doing freelancing. You got a fire, it's pandemonium. Everyone's doing everything they can. In fact, one of the videos that you saw earlier on the last presentation was from the Old Gulch fire in 1988, where the operations section chief got on the radio and said, there is no command and control. Everybody is authorized to freelance. I said, what kind of operation is that? I mean, of course, that was 20 some odd years ago. But that's not what we want right now. We want to have leaders' intent. We want to have appropriate actions based on that leader's intent. So I may not give specific instructions for your strike team or that engine company, but then when they get out there, I've articulated enough that they can meet my goals, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. That operational resources assigned to structures not immediately threatened are going to work. They're going to make that house stand alone. They're going to make that house defendable, and then they can move on to the next one. You've probably seen videos of the classic line of fire engines sitting on a cul-de-sac. There's no work to do. Guys half dressed in Nomex, sitting on their bumpers, sitting in lawn chairs. We're trying to get away from that because that's a waste of resources. It takes people out of their initial attack stations. Taxpayers are paying for that, and it's all for nothing. So what we decided in California is that it may be appropriate to order them. If we order them, they're going to go to work. And they're going to work, they're going to map it, they're going to come up with a defense plan, and they're going to move on to the next one. That property owners have a responsibility to prepare their structure. In California, we do have a 100-foot defensible space law. It's called Public Resources Code 4291. In that law, it says 100-foot or up to your property line. Written right into California code, and we've enforced it for many, many, many years. What's happening now, though, is that the insurance industry is saying 300 foot. So they'll look at your house out there and they'll go, aha, you've got brush within 300 foot of your house. Jack the rates up. And he has no recourse to get that 300 foot defensible space. And so in our system, we said we're going to do 100 foot because that's what our law says. And it may not mean that if you have 100 foot, your house will be saved. 100 foot's our minimum. It also says that if I show up with my fire engines and I've got 2 homes, somebody's got no clearance whatsoever, somebody's got 100 foot of clearance, and I've got a good rip and fire, well, I'm not, public safety and firefighter safety is my number one concern. I'm going to go to the house that actually did some clearance. I'm going to try and defend that house. That all resources to structure defense should be trained and have proper gear. That's a given, I should say. And that we're going to order the closest and deploy the most appropriate resources, so that there's a large amount of tools that we all have out there. You guys may not all have Wildland classic Type 3 fire engines, what I would consider a Type 3 fire engine, but you may have patrols, you may have larger engines with a Wildland complement. You're going to order what's most appropriate and deploy it. A lot of times somebody would show up and go, well, I've got a Wildland fire, I need 1,500, or not 1,500, I need 100 I need 100 municipal engines. Well, why? Because it's going to come out to the road and I'll stop it there. Well, like I said earlier, put it out, you don't need it. Or they'll say, hey, it's a Wildland fire, I don't need any structural engines. That's not appropriate. You order the most appropriate and get them out there. So that's part of our leader's intent. We're trying to get away from structure groups, structure branches. It's kind of a weird thing with ICS. If you're familiar with ICS, you have a chunk of land and everybody has a common one boss. Everybody works from one boss. It's called a unity of command. Of course, what do? We have a division. It's a geographic area from point A to point B. You're in charge of that. You've got 5 engines in that division. Then I lay a structure group over the top of it. I give it to you. I give you 5 engines. 2 supervisors, exactly the same rank in the same chunk of land. How does that work? Sometimes great, sometimes not so great. Hey, if you only had 10 engines, you could put the fire out. If you had 10 engines, you could defend the homes. But your goals, your specific instructions from your boss are different. Defend homes, put the fire out. So how do we figure that out? So what we've done now is we said, all right, what you're going to do is you're going to go out there, I'm going to give you 10 engines, you're going to defend the homes, and you're going to put the fire out from point A to point B. 1 supervisor, 1 set of objectives. That's kind of our goal right now. So that's our leader's intent. Like I say, I think I've got some around here somewhere if they haven't already been passed out. If you want to take a peek at it, you can. One of the things we looked at is structure protection. Structure protection implies that structure, in our mind, that structure could be saved. And so the civilians are going, hey, I pay taxes. I pay for my fire department. My house burnt. They didn't even go up there. What gives? Well, we're trying to say it's structure defense. Offense to me, structure protection is an offensive step. I'm going out there, I'm going to offensively try and protect that home. If I put it to structure defense, that's a different mindset. So I'm not going to do structure protection, I'm going to do structure defense because firefighters are naturally offensive minded. We want to extinguish the fire. Once I realize I'm doing structure defense, at some point I've got to click over to be offensive minded. So I'm going to send some folks up there to defend those homes. I got to have somebody else come put that fire out, all right? So structure defense. And what we're also telling our firefighters based on our leader's intent is oftentimes it may not be safe to defend those homes. And the safest tactic for my firefighters is to back out, let the fire go through, and then go back in after the fire front's gone through. And we just learned in our last presentation from Jack Cohn that the vast majority of our fires are not burning in the first 5 minutes of contact. They're burning afterwards, oftentimes up to a day or 2 days later. Green Valley fire a couple years ago, we had fires burning 48 hours, 72 hours past that. Same thing on the Hesesita a couple years ago. So we want to make sure that when we're defending structures, we do it with the firefighter safety in mind, and we do it appropriately. So you'll hear now in our terminology and in the fire scope terminology, structure defense, not structure protection. Make sense? Any questions on that? All right. So we want to maintain our situational awareness. And how are we going to do that? Well, we want to have effective fire behavior forecasting. Not all of us are in the fire service or in the wildland fire service. And so how does somebody who doesn't typically do wildland fire protection or wildland urban interface stuff, how do we get your situational awareness? How do you understand that? One of the things you can do is go through the incident response pocket guide. It talks about how to protect yourself. How do you look at a fire and do a effective fire behavior forecast? Look up, look down, look around also gives you that as skills. Campbell's prediction system. There's lots of them out there, very simple ways that you can research and look at to look at a fire, base it on your knowledge of your fire weather, your knowledge of your winds, your fuels, and then apply it. But the important thing here with this is that you have situational awareness, that you understand what's going to happen. And it may be, you know, if you look at what happened on Long Island, 5, 6, 8 years ago, tremendous amount of fire. Of course, who thinks of Long Island as having fire, you know, wildland fires? But it's going to occur, so you just need to understand when and where, and recognize those extreme fire behavior. One of the things we want to talk about is fire entrapment avoidance, and how to avoid being entrapped to begin with. So again, back to the incident response pocket guide. There's some steps to avoid it, and that's right in there. Everybody should have an IRPG. You can download them offline. You can order them. I'll give you a website here, or I think the sheet that Swan pulled out earlier has a link to the IRPG. All our firefighters carry them in their pocket. And in fact, when we check into bases, that's one of the things that some of the departments are asking now is, hey, where's your red card? And does everyone have an IRPG? Because we're becoming so dependent upon it. In the IRPG, there's an entrapment avoidance. And one of the things, first thing up is situational awareness. Do you understand what's happening today? Situational awareness, in a nutshell, is what's happening now, what's going to happen in the future, and how are your actions, the firefighters' actions, going to affect what happens in the future so that you can properly predict that outcome. So, maintaining your situational awareness, having an idea what your hazards are. In the case of some of the videos we saw, what were some of the hazards in the video we just saw, where the guys are around the house? What's a hazard? I'm sorry? Mulch. The mulch, is it? All right, so that mulch is going to burn, and it's going to be very intense, but a low flame. But that it would be a hazard. What's another hazard? How about just walking around the trees? All right? How many of you guys have seen fire like that on a regular basis? So inexperience may be a hazard. If you have seen them, so what are some other hazards that were out there? The visibility. So are you sucking up a lot of carbon monoxide? And so are you thinking straight? Have you been in that smoke for the last little bit? Can you see the head of the fire? So there's lots of stuff out there. So those are you want to do a hazard assessment and then a hazard abatement or mitigate it. So how can we do that? Well, for your case, have lookouts or have somebody out with a radio or have good communication. For the mulch, put it out or distribute it. So there's ways to mitigate it. So look at it, have a good hazard assessment, a good mitigation. What's a decision point? Decision point or management action point or a trigger point are things that say, hey, when that fire crosses that line right there, I'm going to do this. Or when that fire moves that we just saw, if that fire moved from the ground fire into the crown fire, we went from 2-foot flames to 40-foot flames, we jump in the engine and we drive away. That's a decision point. So have decision points and get them out. You guys all have those now. You're going inside a structure, you're walking down or you're crawling down the hall with your firefighters, starts to roll around behind you, you pencil out in front of you. If you can't put it out, what do? You back out, right? That's a decision point. Same thing. You just need to understand them for the WUI. So get your decision points, make sure everyone knows them, and then evaluate. That's part of your situational awareness. Another one is understanding the 10, the 18, the common denominators, all that kind of stuff. That's in the IRPG, the pocket guide. It's part of the training that you heard of in an earlier lesson. And then having those decision points that are realistic. So one of the things that, again, what we're trying to figure out is that decision point is based on good sound fire behavior. All right? So this is a typical Santa Ana type fire that we look at in California. I understand it's not the same thing that you guys are all going to experience, but the crazy thing about this is, oops, I did it. This is Griffith Park. Griffith Park is in the middle of Los Angeles. It's surrounded by literally millions and millions and millions of people. I wouldn't think naturally of I might think of the Cabazon area or the San Diego area or in the foothills where we're having the fires now. You wouldn't think of Griffith Park as having a fire problem, but here it is right there. So fire starts, typically what they'll say is, hey, get in there, save some homes. There's not a lot of command structure set up. We're still trying to figure it out. Don't have a lot more information. You just get in there and put some fire out. Our firefighters, and that's pretty common for what's happening in the last couple of years, even right now. So our firefighters would then show up and be faced with something like this. And as part of that, what we tell them is get in there, save some homes, get your LCES, make sure you have escape routes and safety zones. All right, so engine captain walks in there, takes care of this. There's not a whole lot of places in there that's safe right now. I'll go back. So grant me that that's probably a 6, 7-story building. It's a hospital. Give me that one, right? Okay, so if we measure against that 6 or 7-story hospital, how big do you think these flames are? Somebody say something. 30 feet, 40 foot, all right? It's a lot of flame. And we just listened to Jack Cohn talk about that. That's going to hurt. So is it appropriate for me, the supervisor, to tell you, the engine captain, hey, get in there, save some homes, make sure you have your lookouts and safety zones. I've given you an assignment. It's unrealistic. You've accepted that assignment. That's unrealistic. People are going in and getting hurt. Once we've showed that to management, and they said, that makes sense. Now they're liable. So that's one of the reasons we put together this book. So you've got to have safety zones. It's something we throw out all the time. Have a safety zone. Get your safety zones. Make sure you have an escape route to your safety zones. What's a safety zone? Place where you go to not get burned up. That's a good one. We should be able to stand there dressed just like this, not have an issue. So if you go to the IRPG, what does the IRPG say? It says 4 times the maximum height of the flame. So if we went back to, I'm sorry, you said 40 foot? So 40 foot. I got to have 4 times the height of the flame. So 40 times 4 is, somebody who didn't go to my high school. All right, so that's big. All right, and we said an acre is 200 by 200. So we're talking a lot. I'm trying to give you a visual. All right. And if you look at the IRPG, it specifically says when in the wildland urban interface or around structures, this may not apply. But that is a standard that we use as wildland firefighters. So where am I going to find 160 foot? And if that fire is going to burn around me, I got to have 160 foot to me and 160 foot on the other side. And 160 foot over here, 160 foot there. I'm talking a couple acres now, right? Where am I going to find that in the middle of Los Angeles? That goes back to my earlier statement. Hey, get in there, protect some homes, get your safety zones and escape routes. I gave you an order that you cannot carry out safely. Those guys are accepting orders that they cannot carry out safely. So we got to come up with a better way to do this. So what we came up with are temporary refuge areas. All right. As a hotshot, when I was first started out, and as an engine company officer, we'd be out there, especially as a hotshot, you're scratching along, you're moving along, pulse is up a little bit. Stand up for a second. I'm sorry about that. What's your name? John. So John's my simulated tree. I'm scratching as long as my McLeod do my stuff, heats up a little bit. I'm going to stand behind John. John's going to get hot, and I'm good. John's my tree, right? That's a temporary refuge area. Pretty simple, right? That makes sense. Been out there on a wildland fire. You're working. You got your engine. You're parked. Gets a little hot. Get a blast at you. You walk back around to the lee side of the building. Let the heat blow over the top of you. Let the smoke go around the building. It pulses. It settles down. Backs away. Go back around. Extinguish the deck. Put a little bit of vegetation out. You've saved the home. I just used a temporary refuge area, right? Okay. Very simple concept. It doesn't mean you don't need safety zones. Doesn't mean you don't need escape routes. But what we were finding is you go through literature of fatality fires, of near-miss fires, of injuries. We found our firefighters were leaving relatively safe areas, traveling along escape routes through more dangerous areas to get to a safety zone. And as they did that, they were dying along that escape route because we were told, hey, got to get to your safety zones. Use your escape routes, get to your safety zones. What we're trying to get them to do now is say, hey, use a temporary refuge area, a TRA, time it, and move from place to place to place as you evacuate. All right, you can use TRAs offensively, you can use them defensively. But when you use a TRA, you have to have tactical mobility. Tactical mobility is something we pulled out of the armed forces. They use it all the time. They don't want to be pinned down, so they always have a place to move. They always have some tactical mobility. So TRA requires that. If I go to the safety zone that you talked about, you're stuck there, in theory, right? Because you're in a safe spot. TRAs, I may need my PPE. I may need to pull a shelter up and use it as a shield. And when I do that, things in my brain are clicking. Something's going wrong here. I need to get out of here. I need to finish my escape route, but I'm going to do it in a safe method. And I'm going to use those rocks, those shields. I'm going to use my house that I'm protecting. I'm going to use my engine. Those are all TRAs. So, tactical mobility, here's our definition. It's a pre-planned area where firefighters may take refuge, temporary shelter from short-term thermal relief without the use of a fire shelter in the event that my escape routes to safety zones are compromised. When I start using TRAs, if I'm using them defensively, I need to realize that and start moving out towards safety zones. So there's some examples of them. The structure, inside the structure, on the Hesacita fire in Santa Barbara, many firefighters used structures as temporary refuge areas. They went inside, structure caught on fire, their engines burned up, and then or not, and then they left the structure and went back outside, were able to drive away or walk away. Some of them were on SCBAs, some of them used structural PPE, some of them just used their Wildland Nomex. On the Hesacita fire, we chose to drive away. My temporary refuge area was my vehicle. We drove out to our safety zones. The fire blew through. We went back in. So there's different ways to do that. There's lots of TRAs. Anything could be a TRA as long as it provides temporary refuge. And you understand that you have to be able to walk away from that to keep that ability. Now, how do we use them offensively? Well, I remember an earlier analogy. You're sitting on the house. You got opposing lines around the house. Fire comes up to it. You back around to the lee side of it. You take shelter around it. Fire blows through. You go back around like the firefighters did in the video we just saw. Go back around. Put the fire out. That's an offensive use of a TRA. Make sense? All right. It's a new concept. It's not without its challenges. There's many people who still would say that it's not appropriate. It does not replace safety zones. It does not replace escape routes, but it gives you an option to do something to keep yourself safe. All right. So we're sitting there at the structure. Our engines are always pointed out. We always have an escape route. We'll drive them in, position them, and have them ready to go. Modern engine, though, will not stand up to a sustained fire. Traditionally, what we taught in California is that you use that engine. And the classic example is the crank fire from '87. And in 1987, two Forest Service engines and a CAL FIRE engine and a CAL FIRE hand crew rode out a burnover up in the northeast side of California. Cell came over, blew a fire up there under tall pines. And there was a video from the top, and there was pictures down below, and then they did a really good job of narrating it and of videoing the guys afterwards. And the classic example is, that's what we used to teach them, is you put fire shelters on the windows. But remember, 60s, 70s, and 80s, we had metal fire engines, which is kind of strange now. But metal fire engines, and these guys were sitting in there, an old Forest Service crew engine captain with an old military-issue metal canteen, and he says, I heard some thumping. He said, what the heck's that thumping? Realized it was the water boiling in his canteen sitting on the dashboard, but his engine was still sound. Today's fire engines aren't going to do that. Why? Because we now have plastic fire engines. So you need to look at that. Your engine is a TRA to a point. If it's going to burn up, we're now saying you better get out and use a fire shelter. If it's not going to burn up and it's still mobile, drive that thing away. All right, so key point there. When using an engine or a structure as a TRA, you need to look at the fire behavior. You need to look at the fuels around it. Which one's going to be safer? Is it going to withstand a sustained fire front? How long will that sustained fire front be? Which side of the building is going to take the hit first, and then you pre-position in the other side of it. Have hoses ready with you. Have SCBA with you. All that kind of stuff, and put that fire out if you can, because that's that's why you're at the structure. Is one, to be safe, but two, to protect the structure. So there's things you can do. We do teach to use structures and engines as TRAs, but again, I'll tell you, if you think you got to use that structure as a TRA, probably should be in your fire engine driving away. Bodies of water, a couple very, very famous recent fatalities and near misses within my department, within some others, notably the 30 Mile. They had water right there. So we don't say jump in the water. You know, look at what happened to Esperanza. Those guys left a pool, and I was at Esperanza. I mean, I was supervising Esperanza not during the burnover, but at 2 o'clock, 5-6 hours afterwards, I was the ops on the Esperanza. So I was there. I saw it. Those guys left plastic lawn chairs. They left grass that was still burning in the cracks of the wood fence around it. The wood slat fence was still there, 6 hours afterwards. And they left that relatively safer area out into the brush where they ultimately died. So we don't necessarily say jump in the pool. There's just not a lot of empirical data on is it safer? Why is it not? So our department's chosen a stance that says, hey, drive away, get away. Your pools or your creek or your boggy or bottoms or whatever, last resort. All right, so at some point, we're going to have to figure that one out there, Mr. NIST. But until then, what we're teaching is, get away. If you got to use it, use it. And I would probably use that pool. One of the things we did is we tried to categorize, because you used to have winners and losers within the West, not even California. Winner, this house is a winner, that house is a loser. We had good ones and bad ones. We had standalones. What's a standalone? I don't know. So we tried to say, all right, let's figure out what we're going to call these homes and standardize it. So we came up with 3 for how to identify a house. First one is not threatened. This house is not threatened by that fire behavior. So there's lots of grass around it. They've done some defensible space. There's lawn in here. There's lots of cement. Good composition roof, hardened structure. So based on the fire behavior, a grass fire, 2, 3, 4 foot flames, that house is not threatened. I may put an engine there if I got lots of engines, or I may not, because if I got other places I got to go. So one of the things you'll see with this terminology, and terminology we're about to see, the tactics is we're trying to standardize. So that if I show up at your fire and you say, hey, Phil, take your guys, I want you to vertically ventilate. That's a common tactic, right? I understand what it is that you want me to do. You understand what you're telling me to do. Get up on the roof, cut a hole. If you tell me take a line inside and do a right-handed search pattern, that's a pretty common tactic. There's probably not an engine company here that wouldn't know what that means. If I tell you that this is not threatened, in about 5-6 years, our firefighters, as they get through and start to incorporate this into their vocabulary, it's going to be the same thing, especially with the tactics. Hey, this is a prep and go. That's what we want, that kind of familiarity. So, not threatened. Next one is threatened defensible. There's TRAs here, there's safety zones here, there's things here that make this house defendable and safe for us to do it. And if we don't defend it, if we don't put an engine there, it's probably going to get burned. So we want to call that threatened defensible. Means we probably need to put somebody there to defend it. And again, that definition, there's TRAs, there's safety zones, there's places for my big apparatus, there's construction features, or there's fuel mitigation features that allow us to stay there. Or, in this case, that's a head fire running that direction, so it's a flanking fire coming at me, and that flanking fire intensities is such that that house needs protection, but it's safe enough for my firefighters. Going back to the fire line handbook that we looked at earlier. So this one we're going to call threatened non-defensible. No safety zones, no TRAs, no fuel mitigation, and that house is, that structure is not a house, it's an old barn, probably not worth risk versus gain putting a firefighter in there and risking their lives or my fire apparatus. So in that case, it's threatened non-defensible. Those are the 3 terms we're going to start using in fire scope. Make sense? All right. Are those consistent? Are they always going to be threatened non-defensible? No. All right. Those things are always it's always going to change. I could go all the way back to here, and under a Santa Ana wind condition, this grass is putting off 25, 30-foot flames. That house may be threatened, non-defensible, just based on the fire behavior. Or I got a crew in here that doesn't feel comfortable doing it. Or I got a ladder truck instead of an OES, a California OES Type 3. It's not going to work. So you got to look at the skills, knowledge, and abilities of the crew. You got to look at the fire behavior at the time and how it's going to go. This house could be impacted, or this barn could be impacted by fire at 2 o'clock in the morning, and it's a creeping ground fire. That's certainly defendable. Could be 2 o'clock in the afternoon, it's a 40-foot flame wall. It's not defendable. Common sense, fire behavior, situational awareness, all got to have all that. All right. So you put a group of firefighters together, as we did, as a working group. You can't walk out without an analogy. You got to have some sort of acronym, because I think it's part of our union contract. So we came up with an acronym. It's called SFACS, Survivor Facts. Survival Facts, excuse me. And we have those. I think Rick's going to pass these guys around. This is a visor card that was developed, and that goes up on the visor of all of our apparatus. It's a laminated card. It's not available online, but I've given it to you here. I can send it to you electronically with the leader's intent and other stuff if you want. But all of our firefighters carry it. It's got this survival facts. So it's just an acronym that helps our new company officers figure out, is this house savable? So, is it survivable based on the fire behavior I see when it gets here, for the firefighters with the civilians that are there? If it's not survivable, we're driving away. I'm evacuating the civilians. You evaluate the fire behavior and the fire environment, the fuels, weather, and topography we talked about earlier. Is it 10-foot flames or 50-foot flames? What's the fire behavior at the time it's going to get here? That's part of your evaluation. Your access, can I get fire engines in there? If it gets smoky, can I get fire engines out? Can I get my fire engine in there? Do I have to get a patrol or a little brush rig? How's that going to work? For ingress and egress, how many can I get in there? Clearance and construction, is there clearance around that? Again, in California, I'm looking for 100 foot. In Colorado Springs, it may be different. In your area, it may be different. But is there enough clearance to meet it? Is that building hardened to protect it? What's the construction like? Is there time constraints? Can I get in there, do a quick survey, make that house defendable before the fire gets there, or am I going to get caught in the middle of it? So what are the time constraints for that fire to get there? If these things don't add up, you're either staying or going. That's the S, stay or go. So that's the S facts. And we're starting to train all that so that as they go out there and do it, they can see it. Evacuations. Evacuations are big with us because in California, fire department doesn't do the evacuations. We are legally allowed to do it, but I'm not in charge of it. I'm not the agency having jurisdiction of law enforcement. It's law enforcement. So we want to make sure that we coordinate with law enforcement. So when I show up on a fire and I need to evacuate a road, a community, one person, I've got to get a cop with me, the police department or the sheriff's department with jurisdiction, and put that out. Again, in California, I, as a fire department, have ultimate authority for the fire side of things. So that's it's an advantage on our side. So we want to have the cops sitting with us. We want to utilize the cops in our as an evacuation branch or in a unified command and keep them engaged, because we found that if we don't keep the cops involved, they're going to do it themselves. I had a fire last year, a couple thousand acres. I'm looking at it. Where's the fire going? It's going this direction. I always tell the cops, I tell my young firefighters as well, follow the smoke. If you're underneath the smoke column, you're at where the fire's going. So I go, cops, where are you evacuating? What are you doing? Because I need some stuff done. And they're way over here, and the fire's going this direction. So we had to regroup them. We embed them with us, we embed with them, and we're all together. If you don't do that, like I say, at least in California, they'll go off on their own. Firescope Fob came up with a checklist that's available on the website. You can look at it. It's an emergency checklist for evacuations. I'll go with that in a second. But they also came up with protective actions. These are the protective actions. So in California, some of them will say, hey, we've got mandatory evacuations. Well, What's a mandatory evacuation? Because in California, the law says you cannot mandatory evacuate somebody. I can't make you leave your house in California and go. Case law has said that. So how can you do a mandatory evacuation? Well, it's kind of a bluff. They did one this year on the mountain fire. It was what do they call it when you, it doesn't matter. When you're a precautionary mandatory evacuation. That was a press release. We've issued a precautionary mandatory evacuation. Well, what's a precautionary mandatory evacuation? So what we're trying to push is evacuation warnings, evacuation orders, sheltering in place, and rescue. Those are the 4 things. So again, going back to tactics, when I show up, hey, I need you to go up there. I got a bunch of people sheltered in place. I need you to go up and rescue them. Very clear on that tactic of what I want to occur. Common terminology, right? That's an ICS principle. So evacuation warning alerts civilians to the potential to go. The evacuation order is an immediate evacuation based on an immediate threat. Try not to bluff with these things. When we call them, because what we found is that if you put people into a warning all the time, pretty soon they're not going to go. The other thing that we do is that we may mix those things together. I may, as the cops go down knocking on doors, there may be an able-bodied guy there that says, hey, you're in an evacuation warning. You need to have your books ready, your paperwork, your articles, get your kids together, your dogs, your whatever it is you want to go. If it goes to a warning, you probably need to go, right? Go to the next house. Somebody's got an invalid, 90-year-old, bedridden parent. They're going to go right into an order because you need an ambulance, you need a special vehicle, you need oxygen cylinders and stuff like that. So we'll use those things together concurrently based on the need. Sheltering in place, oftentimes we'll shelter folks in place because it's safer for them to stay there than to move down the escape routes to get out. Esperanza Fire, again, we did that at Poppet Flats where we sheltered several thousand people in place for 2 or 3 days until the roads were opened and then moved them out. The last one is rescue. You don't want to move people from one area to another if it's more dangerous, so you're sheltering them in place, but they may not have a chance to get out. So that's when engines are going in, grabbing people, cops are going and grabbing people, putting them in the back and running out. Those are the 4 protective actions that we talk about. Keys to evacuations are early identification, figuring out where it's going to go, early coordination with the folks who are going to do the evacuations, if it's you, under your plan, or if it's the cops under a different plan, early integration. Having good decision points. Happened here not too long ago where I said, my decision point is this hill, this ridge for this community. Okay? How long is it going to take you to get to evacuate everyone out of this community? Well, it's going to take me 4 hours reflex time to get enough people in there to evacuate everybody out. Okay, well, if the fire crosses this ridge, my F-band predicts that it's going to get from the ridge to the community in 3 hours. That's not going to work, is it? So now you got to come up with a different decision point. So early identification of decision points, validate them and get them out. Co-locate, like we talked about with the cops. We put the cops out in the field with our operations people. We put them in the ICP with us. We have a single ICP. It's an ICS principle. We make sure our liaison officers have good rapport with the A-reps from the cops, and we have established a really good communication system. It's working very well now. They have issues. The cops are going to have issues, though. Evacuations, traffic control points, animal issues. They're going to have, where are they going to put all these people? So we need to understand that their mutual aid system, they got to bring folks in to help them as well. So there's going to be reflex time with that. So we need to support that as well. We developed a WUI placard card. Now, it used to be that how do you identify that there's even a house there, or that house needs help, or that there's people up there, or that you've actually gone up there? In California, cops sometimes use notified. They'll hang a flag that says notified. To them, that means they've gone up there and said, hey, knucklehead, there's a fire coming, you better leave. They've been notified. There was a while there we were hanging black flagging and red flagging, or black flagging, white flagging. Black was something that said, that this house, don't go up there, it's dangerous. The white flagging means you can go up there. Well, then John looks at it and goes, God, my flagging's black and Phil's flagging's white and his dog barks all night. Take my black flagging, put it on his house, take his white flagging, put it in my house. then everyone goes to his house and my house burns down. Didn't really work for us, and that's very subjective. So what we came up with was a placard, and I think that was passed around, adopted by FireScope. That's great. And this placard is starting to be used now. A couple of weeks ago, we hung over 3,000 of these things in the community of Idlewild up in Riverside County. They went up, they used them, over 3,000 in 2 days, came down in less than a day. Very good thing. So what does this do? Well, it gives you some options here. It's 8.5 by 11. Try and do it on cardstock. You write it with a big pen. You can tape them up, you can staple them up, but it gives you an idea of what you're looking at without having to drive up there and do it yourself. You can show up down a street, see these things, and go, all right, I'm going to save this house, or I'm going to defend this house, but not that one, based on this little thing. All right, so that's how it's used. It says it's municipal engine accessible, it has a water source, it's defendable. This slash means that there's no civilians up there. If it was circled, it means that there's civilians up there. Put some information in the bottom, and then you sign it. Here's Idlewild again. So there's a house. Got a flag up there. So looking at that thing, it's kind of hard to tell what's going on from the street. You look at it. It's not accessible from the municipal engines. There's your address. There's no water source. It doesn't have a 100-foot defensible space. There's nobody there. It's got a lock gate with propane in the back. This was done on the 19th of July. So if you're showing up on the 23rd, that's still up there. Here's another one. In this case, it's accessible. It does have 100-foot defensible space, and there's a wood pile near the back of the home. Finding it works real well. So traffic control points. We want to have traffic control points to meter out ingress and egress to our incident. So we will help with law enforcement. We've identified ways to do this. We're going to color code them. Level 1, 2, 3, and 4, put these on a map that Joe's guys will produce. Level 1 allows residents only. 2 restricts the traffic to only critical infrastructure. So it may be that after a fire goes through, I need to get the road people back in there to put the guardrails back up. I need to get power folks in there to restring line. I may need to get water folks in there to restore water to the infrastructure. 3 is orange. Only cops and us can go in there, doing evacuations typically at the beginning of an incident or when it's really running. And then this one here restricts everybody. So if it's ripping through the roads, you don't want anybody in there. Tell the cop, hey, it's a level 5 restriction. Cops really don't know. Level 5, that means nobody. They can do that, right? So we've identified the closure levels. There's an evacuation guidelines, a very quick evacuation guidelines in FireScope. You can look at those online. What we did was we expanded on it a little bit. And we have a more extensive evacuation guideline. This helps us to focus us on how it is what we want to see and what we want to do every single time. So this is a multi-page document. I can certainly give this to you as well. Got all the instructions in it. It has some definitions so you can sit down and remember, okay, what is it I'm trying to do with all the closure and the protective actions? And it's basically one page. What's the affected area I want to do, and what is it that I want to do in that affected area? What's the decision points to actually get it done? And then sign it. If I just got to do a down and dirty evacuation plan, that's it. I want to put this into a warning. I want to put this into an evacuation area. I have 2 hours to do it. Ops signs it, cops sign it, IC signs it, we're done. Remaining pages then talks about the traffic control points, how you want to set up your perimeter. You're evacuating people, so how are you going to do it? So public, how are you going to do that notification? Are you doing it by phone, reverse 911, emergency alert system, sirens, door to door? Who's doing it? When they're going to do it? What are the routes for the folks into it? Both emergency responders in as well as public out, because you don't want to have them on the same roads. Where are you sending them to for public shelters? Where are your animals going? Again, the definitions. And then at some point, you got to get them back in the house. So you're going to repopulate it, all right? So that's all in there. All right, so how do I get back to it? There it is. So that obviously takes time, but we're trying to script it out. So structure defense. As I said earlier, best way to do it is to defend the structures. Put the fire out. If you can't, put the fire out using traditional things, you got to get into structure defense, and the tactics are what we were talking about. One of the things we're talking about with the military coming in, one of the few benefits of the last couple of years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq is we're getting great information from our vets that are coming into the fire service, and they're bringing in some great terminology. So PACE and DRAW-D are in fire scope documents. I strongly encourage you to, if you're not familiar with PACE and DRAW-D, it helps young officers and even helps me, to give commanders intent, leaders intent, and understand where I am with the situation. I'm not going to go through them all right now, but they are in the fire scope document. I strongly encourage you to look at these things, or I'll be around afterwards to walk through them with you, because they're very good tools to help new supervisors and old supervisors. We talked about independent action versus freelancing. We want to avoid that. So I'm not going to go too far into this one. Trying to make sure you get you guys out of here. So the tactics. If your wildland tactics fail, or you show up and you got fire in the WUI, then you got to do some stuff. And these are the ones we're saying. There's 3 primary tactics and 5 secondary tactics. And so I want to walk through those. So check and go. Again, in the fire scope document, check and go, it's all in there. It has more information. Check and go is, hey, this house is about, or this subdivision is about to hit. You don't have time to spend a lot of effort on it, or fire behavior is such that you can't stay there and make it safe. So you're going to drive into this thing, you're going to look at it, make sure there's nobody there, maybe shut a garage door, but basically you're just checking it, making sure there's no immediate life threat from other people, and you're leaving. So you park in there, facing out, big flames come in, run around real quick, knock on the doors, make sure there's no kids in there, no civilians, and get out. Map it for coming back later. Prep and go is you're going to spend a couple minutes there. You're going to show up, spend a couple minutes at the house, maybe foam it, maybe gel it, shut the windows, put a sprinkler on, do something, I don't know, evacuate civilians. But still, there's no TRAs or safety zones, or you just got a bunch of these homes, and you have time to prep and go, and prep a bunch of homes. So in this case, they're there, they're putting out some spot fires, they shut the garage door, they're foaming it, and then they're off to the next one. Prep and defend is a classic, you show up, you're going to stay there, you're going to be there for the duration. There's TRAs there, there's safety zones there, great thing for municipal engines to do. So in this case, I got a dozer starting to come in here with some indirect line to try and go direct on it. Aircraft are boxing it off, but these guys are going to be in there. So they've got lines deployed, and they're there. They found a water source. They're extinguishing spot fires. Pointed out to get out of there. They're ready to go. They're going to stay there for the duration now. Going back to Jack Cohn's stuff, it's afterwards that we're losing a lot of our homes. And it may be that we're doing prep and go because it's such a fire front. So we're going to do a fire front following tactic, which is we're going to go in there, do a prep and defend, prep and go. We're going to prep that house, foam it, gel it, harden it, take our escape routes out to safety zones, wait for the fire to blow through, and then do fire front following, going after the fire goes through. It's a defensive tactic, and all of those we've talked about so far are defensive tactics. So at some point, we got to go offensive and put the fire out, remember. Usually used under extreme conditions, and you go in afterwards, put the fire out. So the fire's already gone through, you protect your homes. Or you extinguish the homes that are burning, stop your ember protection, and stop your embers that are in the peaks of the roofs, on the decks, and the ground cover and stuff like that. Bump and run is an evolution that we do in front of the fire, typically, although sometimes you may get stuck behind it. It can be an offensive attack if you're steering that fire to a certain area. So in this case, you're in front of the fire front, you're bumping and running in front of it, basically trying to extinguish stuff and harden the structures quickly and keep moving. In this case, since he's got lines pulled out, this fire front may move past them, in which case they'll just bump right into the front of it again once they're ready. Anchor and hold is kind of a newer tactic. What we've found is when the fires run 30, 40, city blocks into a community. It's not the vegetation as we learned earlier, it's structure-to-structure ignition. So we want to put structures out. Typically in the other ones, you're not grabbing hydrants. In this case, you're grabbing hydrants and using big water. So they're hooked to hydrants, they've got lines spread out, master streams, and they're extinguishing homes, not the vegetation. That stops the ember protection. At any time you have the ability to put the fire out, we want you to put the fire out, connect the dots. So if you can go house to house, extinguishing the vegetation, you're saving homes downstream. That's how you steer the fire towards away from the homes or extinguish a fire, which is an offensive tactic, which is what we want. Tactical patrol. I told you at the Green Valley and some of the other ones, we're losing homes 48 hours afterwards. So tactical patrol, it's not fun, it's not glorious. That's putting engines in the burnt structures, and they're just going through mopping up for days on end. It's not glorious, like I say, but it saves homes. ICS organization, we talked about it. We're trying to move folks out of structure protection branches and putting that into the perimeter control division supervisors. And how we're doing it is WUI task forces. Instead of assigning one engine to structure protection or structure defense, design a task force and name them. You know, traditionally task forces or structure groups are named for the area they're protecting. This is the Denver Structure Protection Group. Well, we're going to name them Structure Protection Group 11 or Structure Defense Task Force 11. That way they can move from division, and keep going. So kind of running through that fairly quickly. Those are some of the references that I used to get this. You received all of these websites in your handout. This one here is this presentation that I did online for a webinar if you want to go back and listen to anything. That's all I've got. I appreciate your listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So like we said, we had a lot of information we want to impart to you folks and get the ideas of where we're going here in the future and what's going on with WUI and urban interface with safety and tactics. So I know it's a little late and you guys are on a break, but we're going to be around. We're going to do this again, the afternoon show. If there's any questions, please feel free to ask. And you have our email addresses. If anybody did not get any of the handouts, they're on the back by the water jug back there. Feel free. And we really appreciate it. Thanks for coming.